Chapter 1, Captain's Kingdom. The rain tasted like rust. Jedediah Cole tilted his head and let the cold drops hit his tongue, a grim confirmation of his morning ritual. The water ran in grimy rivulets down the peeling, sun-bleached face of Captain Splash, the park's long-dead mascot. The captain's painted-on smile, a manic crescent of chipped blue paint, seemed to widen in the bleak morning light. Water collected in the mascot's upturned plastic sailor hat before spilling over, tracing a path down one unblinking eye in what looked like a permanent chemical tear. Jade wiped his mouth with the back of a calloused hand and pulled the hood of his patched-up rain slicker lower over his brow. Another day in the kingdom. His kingdom was a ruin. Splashdown Kingdom, the sign out front proclaimed in letters flacking away from sun-rotted plastic. It had been abandoned for almost a decade, a monument to bankruptcy and bad luck. For the last 7 months it was home. Jade's patrol route was an ingrained circuit, a weary path worn into the cracked concrete around the perimeter of their camp. Their camp, which they called the Commune, occupied the former Kitty Cove, arguably the most defensible and least depressing section of the entire park. The shallow pools were long dry, their bright blue paint faded to a chalky powder. A giant fiberglass whale, once a centerpiece that spouted water from its blowhole, now served as their primary rainwater collector, its hollow belly echoing with the drip, drip, drip of the steady downpour. He passed the sad little garden iris tended near the base of the whale. A few hardy weeds and some scraggly root vegetables pushed up through the soil she'd cultivated in a long, rectangular planter box dragged from the park's entrance. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Beyond the garden, huddled under the wide awning of the snack shack, was their main shelter. Tarps, scavenged sheets of corrugated metal, and old park banners were lashed together to create a crude but effective barrier against the wind and rain. A thin curl of smoke rose from a protected fire pit, carrying the scent of burning treated wood and something vaguely like boiled tubers. Marisol Vega was sitting on an overturned bucket just inside the shelter, sharpening a large kitchen knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a familiar, almost comforting sound. She didn't look up as he approached, her focus entirely on the blade. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight, functional bun, and her expression was one of intense concentration. She claimed the snack shack as her infirmary, its stainless steel counters wiped clean 1,000 times, its shelves neatly organized with the pitiful collection of medical supplies she'd managed to scavenge or trade for. Anything. Her voice was low, cutting through the sound of the scraping. "Quiet," Jade answered, his boots squelching on the wet ground. He stopped beside her, peering out into the gray expanse of the park. "Too quiet." Marisol grunted, a sound of cynical agreement. She held the knife up, testing the edge with her thumb. "Quiet is when they get ideas." They were the Rust Dogs, the other inhabitants of Splashdown Kingdom, a harder, meaner group that had claimed the opposite end of the park, holing up in the concrete labyrinth of the main wave pool's machinery building. There was no formal war between the commune and the Rust Dogs, only a tense, unspoken agreement to stay on their respective sides of the lazy river, the unofficial border that snaked through the center of the park. The agreement was violated often enough to keep everyone's nerves frayed to a wire. "Pip, get what we needed?" Jade asked, changing the subject. "Came back an hour ago, got the copper wire from the arcade building." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes holding his. "Took a risk. Said he saw fresh boot prints near the fence line on the west side. Not ours." Jade's jaw tightened. He'd seen the same prints on his own patrol earlier near the dilapidated Sea Serpent Slides tower. Big prints deep in the mud. The kind made by someone heavy, someone not trying to hide their presence. Cormac's people. He see anyone. "No," said. "The place felt wrong, though, colder." Marisol placed the sharpened knife carefully on a clean rag. "He's spooked. Finch is with him, trying to calm him down." Jade grunted. Finch trying to calm anyone down was like asking a lit match to cool a room. The man's anxiety was a communicable disease. But Pip was a good kid, tough and resourceful. If something had shaken him, it was worth nodding. Jade continued his patrol, his hand resting on the heavy steel pipe he carried, its end wrapped in friction tape for a better grip. He moved past the central hub of their small community. Grizz, the hulking ex-trucker, was asleep under a thick blanket, his snores a low rumble. Kyra and Ben were huddled together, reading from a water-damaged paperback, trying to pretend this was all some grand camping adventure. Mama Odette was humming to herself, weaving strips of plastic from old soda bottles into a small, useless basket. Her mind was a frayed rope, but her presence was a strange anchor to a world before this one. He walked the perimeter of Kitty Cove, his eyes scanning every shadow, every potential point of entry. The park was a symphony of decay. The groan of stressed metal from the tall slide towers, the slap of a loose banner in the wind, the incessant drumming of rain on fiberglass and plastic. Sounds he knew, sounds he could place. It was the sounds he didn't know that kept him awake at night. He reached the edge of their territory, where a small, algae-choked canal marked the beginning of the lazy river. Across the murky water, the rest of the park loomed like the skeleton of some fantastic beast. The immense, empty basin of the Kraken's maw wave pool. The twisted mass of slides coiling down from the serpent's spine tower. And somewhere within that maze of concrete and faded glory, Cormac and his rust dogs were watching, waiting. Jade stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. Marisol was right. Quiet was when they got ideas, and Cormac's ideas usually involved taking something that belonged to him. He scanned the opposite bank, his gaze lingering on the dark, square opening of the wave machine building. He imagined them in there, sitting in the dark, their faces lit by a flickering fire, weapons in their laps. Jinx, Cormac's lean and wolfish second, would be pointing out the commune's weaknesses on a crude map. Breaker, their silent brute, would be cleaning his weapon. Twitch would be shaking, desperate for whatever poison Cormac fed him to keep him loyal. A metallic clatter from across the water startled him. It was sharp, distinct. The sound of something heavy being dropped on concrete. Jade dropped into a low crouch behind the peeling facade of a refreshment stand shaped like a treasure chest. He held his breath, listening. For several minutes, there was only the rain and the wind. He was about to dismiss it as a piece of loose scrap metal falling when he saw movement. A figure emerged from the machinery building, tall and lean, silhouetted against the gloom, Even from this distance, Jade recognized the predatory swagger. Cormac. He stood at the edge of the wave pool, hands on his hips, staring directly across the park, directly at the commune's camp. He wasn't hiding. He was making a statement. Jade didn't move. He watched as Cormac stood there, a king surveying his domain, or more accurately, the domain he intended to conquer. The rain plastered Cormac's dark hair to his skull. He raised a hand and casually gestured toward Kitty Cove, as if pointing it out to someone standing beside him in the shadows. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness of the building. Jade's heart pounded a heavy, angry rhythm against his ribs. It wasn't an idea anymore. It was a plan. He could feel it in the air, a charge like the moments before a lightning strike. He stayed low, pulling back from the border, his mind racing. He needed to talk to Pip to hear exactly what the boy saw. He needed to check their defenses, redistribute the scavenged weapons, and post a double watch. The quiet was over. The rust dogs were coming. He looked up at the weeping face of Captain Splash, whose grin seemed wider now, a harbinger of the violence to come. The kingdom was about to go to war. He made his way back to the main shelter, his steps quick and silent. He needed to be the calm center, the unshakable leader. But inside, a cold knot of dread tightened in his gut. They were outnumbered. The rust dogs were better armed and more ruthless. The commune had survived the winter through caution and defensible positioning, but they had never weathered a direct, determined assault. He had to be smarter than Cormac. He had to anticipate his moves. Back at the snack shack, Marisol was cleaning a small wound on Pip's arm. Pip, a wiry teenager with a thatch of dirty blonde hair and eyes that were too old for his face, sat silently, wincing as she applied a dab of antiseptic. Finch, a scarecrow of a man with perpetually trembling hands, hovered nearby. "What happened?" Jade asked, his voice low and hard. Pip looked up, his face pale. "Nothing, just a scrape on the fence." "The fence by the arcade." Pip nodded. "Yeah, the one you told me to stay away from." "Tell me what you saw," Jade commanded, ignoring the small act of disobedience. Pip swallowed. "The prince, like I told Marisol, and something else." He hesitated, glancing at Finch. "In the old maintenance tunnel that runs under the food court, I was just looking. Thought there might be something worth grabbing." "And?" Jade pressed. "It stinks in there," Pip said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Worse than usual, like rotten meat and pool chemicals, and I heard something, a sound, in the big pipe that runs along the wall." "Rats," Finch muttered, wringing his hands. "Place is full of big ones." "It wasn't rats," Pip insisted, shaking his head. "It was wet, a sliding sound, big. I got out of there fast." Jade stared at the boy. A strange smell and an unidentifiable sound. It could be anything. Collapsing infrastructure. An animal. His own fear echoing in a concrete tube. Under normal circumstances, he would have dismissed it. But with Cormac making a display across the park, his instincts screamed that nothing was a coincidence. Every strange detail, every odd occurrence, was now a potential piece of a puzzle he couldn't see. "Did you see anything else?" Jade asked. Pip shook his head. "No, just the sound." "All right," Jade made a decision. "Pip, you're off scavenging duty for a few days. Stay close. Finch, go help Grizz fortify the north entrance. Use the sheet metal we pulled from the ticket booths. Marisol with me." He led Marisol away from the others toward the back of the shelter. "Cormac was out," he said quietly. "He was looking this way. He's planning something." Marisol's face was grim. "We knew this was coming. I need you to get your supplies ready to move. Everything. The antibiotics, the bandages. Pack it tight. If they breach the perimeter, I want you to take Pip and Mama Odette and get to the secondary location." The secondary location was a cramped, miserable crawlspace beneath the Pirate's Plunge ride, but it was well hidden. "And you?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "I'll be convincing them to leave," Jade said, his hand tightening on his pipe. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken violence. He was lying to her, and they both knew it. There was no convincing the Rust dogs. There was only fighting them, and there was no guarantee they would survive the fight. The cold knot in his stomach felt like a block of ice. The kingdom was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. He had to hold it back, no matter the cost. Chapter 2: Dogs in the Engine Room. The air in the Wave Pool's engine room was thick enough to chew. It stank of ozone, damp concrete, and the stale metallic tang of Cormac's own sweat. A single bare bulb, powered by a sputtering gas generator, cast long, distorted shadows that writhed across the colossal machinery. Pistons the size of coffins lay dormant in their housings. A tangle of massive pipes, slick with condensation, snaked across the ceiling and down the walls, disappearing into dark, flooded trenches in the floor. This was the heart of Splashdown Kingdom, and it was the throne room of the Rust dogs. Cormac ran a hand over his shaved head, the harsh light gleaming off his scalp. He was watching Jinx. She was kneeling on the concrete floor, a piece of chalk in her hand, sketching a crude layout of Kitty Cove. Her movements were precise, economical. Every line she drew had a purpose. A square for the snack shack, a circle for the fiberglass whale, an X marking the weakest point in their fence line, the one Pip had spotted earlier. "They're predictable," Jinx said, not looking up. Her voice was a low rasp, devoid of emotion. "Jedediah is a builder, not a soldier. He thinks in terms of walls and straight lines. He'll reinforce here," she tapped a spot on her map, "and here. He'll post his big man, the one they call Grizz, at the main entrance. He'll expect a frontal assault." "And we won't give him one," Cormac finished, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He liked watching Jinx work. She saw the world as a series of problems to be dismantled. It was a useful, brutal kind of intelligence. Breaker, the hulking mute, sat on an overturned crate in the corner, patiently cleaning a long, heavy chain with an oily rag. His face was a placid mask, but his eyes followed Cormac, waiting for a command. Nearby, Twitch was packing, his wiry frame vibrating with a nervous energy that set Cormac's teeth on edge. He was rubbing his arms, his gaze darting into the shadows. "He's getting loud," Cormac said, nodding toward Twitch. Jinx glanced over. "He needs a reason to be useful. He's our key." She drew a new line on her map, a curving, indirect path that started far from the commune's main entrance. It snaked through the skeletal remains of the shipwreck water coaster and ended at the back of the snack shack. "The builder will expect us to come through the door. We'll come through the wall." "The back of that shack is cinder block," Cormac pointed out. And we have Breaker, Jinx replied simply. While Jade and his people are watching the front, Breaker makes a new door. Twitch goes in first. He's fast and he's quiet when he wants to be. He grabs what he can from the infirmary, the antibiotics, the painkillers. Then he's out. We provide covering fire, make a lot of noise from the front to keep their attention, and then we fade back into the park before they can mount a real defense. It was a good plan. Clean. Minimal risk, maximum gain. It would sow chaos and fear, and it would get them the medical supplies they desperately needed. Mags had a nasty gash on her leg that was starting to look angry, and Ratchet had sliced his hand open trying to sharpen a piece of scrap metal. An infection in this place was a death sentence. "What about the girl?" Cormac asked. The medic, Marisol, he'd watched her from a distance. She was disciplined, he respected that. "She's a secondary objective," Jinx said, her voice flat. "If the opportunity presents itself, Breaker can grab her. She'd be more useful here. But the supplies are the priority. We don't get bogged down." Cormac nodded. He trusted Jinx's planning, but his own instincts were screaming for a more direct, more permanent solution. Jade's group was a festering wound on his territory. They were weak, sentimental. They held onto relics of the old world, things like compassion and hope, and he found it offensive. The world had moved on. The strong survived and the weak became resources. "I want to see him," Cormac said, a new thought taking root. "I want to see Jedediah's face when his little fortress comes down." Jinx looked up at him, her chalk-dusted fingers still. "A demonstration is more effective than an extermination. For now, we take their medicine. We show them they can't protect it. They'll be weaker next time, more afraid. Their morale is their center of gravity. We pull it out from under them." She was right, of course. Psychologically, it was the smarter play. But the raw, violent part of him, the part that had kept him alive when the world fell apart, yearned for the simplicity of annihilation. He pushed it down, for now. "Get everyone ready," Cormac commanded, his voice echoing in the vast, mechanical space. "Mags, Ratchet, you're on distraction. I want noise. Make it sound like an army is coming. Breaker, you're with me and Jinx. Twitch." He walked over to the packing man. Twitch flinched as he approached. Cormac reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper containing a few crushed pills. He held it out. Twitch's eyes locked onto it, his whole body seeming to vibrate with need. "You know the plan," Cormac said, his voice a low purr. "You go in, you get the medicine, you come out. You do it right, there's more of this. You fail." He let the threat hang in the air. He didn't need to finish it. Twitch understood. Twitch snatched the packet from his hand, his movements bird-like and jerky. He unfolded it and licked the contents clean in a single, desperate motion. A shudder ran through his body, and a semblance of calm settled over his features. "I won't fail," he rasped. "Good," Cormac turned to the others. "An hour. We move in an hour." The rust dogs moved with a grim purpose, checking their weapons, sharpened pipes, clubs studded with nails, crude spears fashioned from rebar. Cormac picked up his own weapon, a long, thick piece of rebar he'd ground to a vicious point. He ran his thumb along the edge. He could almost feel the phantom sensation of it punching through flesh. He walked to the entrance of the engine room and stared out across the park. The rain had softened to a miserable drizzle. The lights of the commune's pathetic little camp were a smear of yellow in the distance. They were huddled in their right now, thinking their walls would protect them. They had no idea what was coming. They didn't understand the new world. This park wasn't a shelter. It was a hunting ground, and he was the apex predator. But as he stared, his eyes were drawn to the towering structure of the serpent's spine slides. A flicker of movement, he squinted. It wasn't one of his. It was a lone figure, small and hunched, climbing the rusted safety ladder on the outside of the main tower. Cormac recognized the tattered remnants of a brightly colored costume. The hermit, the park's ghost, the man they called Cappy. Cormac watched, intrigued. The hermit was a creature of habit, usually keeping to the upper levels of the food court, a scavenger living on the scraps the real survivors left behind. It was unusual to see him out in the open, especially near the slides. The man reached a platform halfway up the tower and stopped, his back to Cormac. He seemed to be looking down into the dark, gaping maw of the enclosed tube slide known as the belly of the beast. He stood there for a full minute, perfectly still, like a gargoyle mounted on the decaying structure. Then he scrambled back down the ladder and disappeared into the gloom at the base of the tower. Jinx appeared at Cormac's side. "What is it?" "The ghost is taking a walk," Cormac said, a flicker of unease touching him for the first time that day. He'd always dismissed the hermit as a harmless lunatic, a piece of the park's decaying scenery. But his appearance now felt wrong, an omen. "He's irrelevant," Jinx said, her eyes on the commune's camp. "A cracked mirror. He just reflects the decay." Cormac grunted. Maybe she was right, but he couldn't shake the image of the man staring down into the blackness of that slide. The park had its secrets, its dark, quiet places. Mama Odette from the commune was always muttering stories about them, tales the adults dismissed as senile ramblings. Stories of things that lived in the pipes, things that fed the filtration system before the park died. He pushed the thought away. It was a distraction. The hermit was a man. Jedediah was a man. They could all bleed. They could all be broken. The things in the dark were stories for children. The real monsters were the ones who carried weapons and knew how to use them. 1 hour, he repeated, turning away from the slide tower. He looked at Breaker, who nodded once, his hand resting on the sledgehammer he favored for what Jinx called aggressive remodeling. He looked at his crew, their faces grim and hungry in the flickering light. They were ready. The dogs were loose, and they were about to teach the sheep in Kitty Cove a lesson in fear. The supplies were the excuse. The violence was the point. It was time to remind everyone who owned the kingdom. Chapter 3: The Scouts Run. The world smelled of wet metal and old secrets. Pip hugged the crumbling concrete wall, the rough texture scraping against the thin fabric of his jacket. The maintenance tunnel was a place of oppressive silence, a silence so deep it felt loud. The only sounds were the frantic beat of his own heart and the steady drip, drip, drip of water from some unseen leak, each drop landing with an unnervingly hollow echo in the darkness ahead. He'd lied to Jade. He hadn't just gotten a scrape on the fence. He'd come back here. He had to. The sound he'd heard earlier wouldn't leave his head. It wasn't rats. He knew the frantic, scratching sound of the green-finned rats that infested the park. This was different, slower, heavier. A thick, dragging, sliding sound. It had come from the huge, insulated pipe that ran the length of the tunnel, a pipe so large he could have crawled inside it. The main water return line for the east side of the park, Jade had called it once. Cold, dark water used to rush through it, back to the filtration tanks in the engine room. Now it was just a silent, metal python sleeping in the gloom. Or it was supposed to be silent. Pip switched on the small, hand-crank flashlight he'd scavenged, its beam a weak, trembling spear of light against the immense darkness. He hated these tunnels. Jade had forbidden anyone from coming down here alone. The air was bad, the floors were uneven, and some sections were flooded with black, stagnant water. But the tunnels were also the park's arteries. They were the fastest way to get from one end to the other without being seen, and they often led to forgotten storage rooms filled with useful scrap. That's what he'd been looking for. More copper wire for Dell's generator project. He'd found some, a good coil of it in a rusted-out junction box, but then he'd heard the sound. He took a tentative step forward, sweeping the flashlight's beam across the floor. It was slick with a thin layer of grime. He could see his own boot prints from his earlier trip, but now he saw something else. A smear. A wide, greasy trail that crossed the tunnel from a narrow drainage grate in one wall to the flooded section 100 feet ahead. It looked like someone had dragged a leaking bag of oil across the floor. The trail glistened in his light, a dark, iridescent sheen. He knelt, his heart hammering. He didn't touch it, he just brought the light closer. The smell hit him then, thick and cloying. The smell he'd tried to describe to Jade. Rotten meat, but with a sharp, chemical undertone like chlorine and ammonia. It was the smell of decay, but not a natural decay. It was something else, something foul. He followed the trail with his light. It led directly into the murky water of the flooded section. The water was perfectly still, its surface a black mirror reflecting the weak beam of his flashlight. He took another step closer, his curiosity warring with a primal instinct to turn and run. What could have made a trail like that? A leaking barrel? No, the trail was uneven, almost organic in its path. An animal. No animal he knew of left a trail like oil. His light caught something on the edge of the puddle, a small pile of bones. He recognized them instantly. The remains of the park's green-finned rats. He'd seen plenty of skeletons, usually picked clean by other rats. These were different. They looked dissolved. The edges were soft, almost melted, as if they'd been dipped in a powerful acid. And they were lying directly on the greasy trail, as if whatever made the trail had passed right over them. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the darkness behind him. Pip froze, snapping the flashlight off, plunging the tunnel into absolute blackness. He held his breath, straining his ears. Was it one of Jade's people checking on him, or worse, a rust dog? They rarely came into the tunnels. Cormac considered them unsafe, but that didn't mean they never did. He stood there, his back pressed against the cold concrete for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the dripping water. He counted to 100, his heart gradually slowing. Nothing. It must have been the building settling. He let out a slow, shaky breath and was about to turn his light back on when he heard it again. The sound. It was closer this time. Inside the large pipe right next to him. A slow, wet, sliding noise. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-Luwump. S-H-H-H-H-H-H-Luwump. It was the sound of immense, soft weight being dragged through a confined space. It was moving away from him toward the far end of the tunnel in the direction of the rust dog's territory. Pip didn't dare to move. He was paralyzed, caught between the terrifying sound in the pipe and the unknown source of the greasy trail on the floor. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to sprint back to the relative safety of Kitty Cove and never come down here again. But a morbid, reckless curiosity held him fast. He had to see. He had to know what was in his park. He made a decision that he would later regret for the rest of his short life. He didn't run. He followed. He kept his flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust to the deep gloom. A faint gray light filtered down from a ventilation shaft far ahead, providing just enough illumination to make out the dark shapes of the tunnel. He moved slowly, placing each foot with deliberate care, his sneakers making soft, brushing sounds on the grimy floor. He kept one hand on the cold, vibrating metal of the pipe. He could feel the movement inside it, a deep, resonant friction that traveled up his arm. It was huge. Whatever was in, there was as wide as the pipe itself. He followed the sound for what felt like a mile, deeper and deeper into the park's guts. The tunnel began to slope downward. The smell of rot and chemicals grew stronger. He passed another drainage grate and saw another of the greasy smears leading from it. This one was fresher, the iridescent sheen still wet. He realized with a jolt of horror that these grates must connect to the lazy river or the old sewer system. The things had a way in. The pipe alongside him suddenly branched off, a smaller feeder pipe veering into the wall. The main pipe continued straight. The sliding sound continued down the main path, but now Pip heard a new sound from the smaller pipe. A frantic scratching, and a high-pitched, terrified squealing. The green-finned rats. The squealing was cut off abruptly with a sickening, wet crunch. Pip slapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a cry. He backed away, his nerve finally breaking. This was wrong. This was a place of monsters. He had to warn Jade. He had to tell him what he'd found. He turned, ready to sprint, but his foot slipped on one of the greasy patches on the floor. He flailed, his arms pinwheeling in the dark. His hand-crank flashlight flew from his grasp, skittering across the concrete with a loud clatter. It came to a rest 20 feet away, its weak beam pointing directly at the surface of the flooded section of the tunnel. And the surface of the water was no longer still. A single large bubble rose to the surface and popped, releasing a foul burst of air that smelled of bile and stagnant water. Then another, and another. The black water began to ripple, not from a disturbance, but from something rising from below. Pip scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his eyes locked on the spot. He forgot about the sound in the pipe. He forgot about the rust dogs. His entire universe had shrunk to that circle of rippling, black water. A shape broke the surface. It was pale and rubbery, the color of a grub. At first he thought it was just a piece of trash, a floating plastic bag. Then it unfurled. A long, thin, filament-like whisker as thick as his finger rose from the water. It waved slowly in the air like a blind worm searching for food. Then another rose beside it, and another. They weren't whiskers. They were tendrils, feelers. Then the head emerged. It was long and flat like an alligator, but with no eyes. The skin was a translucent corpse white, revealing a dark network of veins pulsing beneath. The mouth was a lipless slit that ran halfway down its head. As Pip watched in silent, frozen terror, the slit opened. It wasn't a mouth full of teeth. It was a perfectly round black hole, ringed with pulsating, fleshy nodules. The gutter gorgon, though Pip had no name for it, swiveled its eyeless head in his direction, drawn by the clatter of his flashlight. The tendrils growing from its snout waved more frantically, testing the air. It didn't see him. It sensed him. It sensed the vibration, the warmth, the living thing that had invaded its territory. With a surge of unimaginable horror, Pip found his legs. He scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't look back. He just ran, his breath catching in painful sobs, his mind a white-hot screen of pure terror replaying the image of that eyeless head, that black hole of a mouth. He heard a tremendous splash from behind him, followed by a sound he would hear in his nightmares forever. The sound of a heavy, wet body dragging itself across concrete at an impossible speed. It was coming after him. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, fueled by adrenaline and a terror so profound it was a physical force. He burst out of the tunnel entrance near the arcade, stumbling into the drizzling rain and the gray light of evening. He didn't stop. He sprinted across the cracked pavement, past the faded, grinning facades of the arcade games, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. He could still hear it behind him, a frantic, wet scrabbling on the concrete, a sound that didn't belong in the world of air and light. He didn't dare look back to see if it had followed him out of the darkness. He just ran for the lights of Kitty Cove, for the shelter of the commune, his voice finally finding purchase in a single, raw, terrified scream. J.I.D. Chapter 4: The Trespass. The scream ripped through the evening gloom, sharp and terrified. Jade was on his feet before the sound even finished echoing off the faded facades of the park. It was Pip's voice. Every head in the commune snapped toward the sound. Grizz was already lumbering forward, a heavy wrench in his hand. Marisol, her face pale, grabbed her medical bag. "Stay here," Jade yelled, his voice a harsh command. "Everyone get inside the shack now." He didn't wait to see if they obeyed. He vaulted over the low wall that bordered their camp, his pipe held ready, and sprinted toward the direction of the scream, the arcade. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and stinging. His mind raced. A rust dog ambush. Did they grab the boy, or was it something else? Pip's story about the tunnel, the strange sound, the melted bones, it all crashed back into his thoughts, no longer so easy to dismiss. He saw Pip then, a small figure stumbling out from between the rusted hulks of the old go-kart track. The boy was covered in mud and something dark and slick. He was running with a wild, panicked gait, his eyes wide with a terror Jade had never seen before. "Pip!" Jade shouted. Pip didn't seem to hear him. He was looking behind him, his face a mask of pure horror. Jade followed his gaze. For a second, he saw nothing but the deepening shadows near the maintenance tunnel entrance. Then, a shape detached itself from the darkness. It was low to the ground, pale and churning, a nightmare of wet, dragging flesh. It moved with a horrifying, unnatural speed, its boneless-looking limbs pulling its long body forward. Jade's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. An animal, a deformed gator. It was the size of a man, but it moved like an insect, scuttling and flowing over the broken ground. This was the source of the sound. This was what lived in the pipes. The creature was closing the distance to Pip. Jade didn't think. He acted. He lowered his shoulder and charged, putting himself directly between the boy and the monster. "Get to the camp, Pip. Run." The gutter gorgon, its eyeless head sweeping from side to side, sensed the new vibration, the larger threat. It changed course, swiveling toward Jade. Its lipless mouth opened, revealing the black, pulsating maw. A low, hissing gurgle emanated from its throat. The smell hit him, the same foul stench Pip had described, rot and chemicals, a smell of utter wrongness. Jade planted his feet, gripping his pipe with both hands. The creature lunged. It was faster than he'd imagined. He swung the pipe with all his strength, a desperate, sweeping arc aimed at its head. The steel connected with a sickening, wet thud. It was like hitting a side of beef packed with gravel. The blow staggered the monster. It recoiled, shaking its eyeless head, but it wasn't down. It wasn't even seriously injured. A dark, viscous fluid, thick like oil, leaked from a gash on its pale hide. Jade backed away, his heart pounding. The pipe had barely hurt it. From the corner of his eye, he saw Pip scramble over the wall into the safety of the camp. Good. The boy was safe. Now he just had to survive. The creature gathered itself and lunged again, its mouth wide. Jade sidestepped, bringing the pipe up in a defensive block. One of the creature's clawed forelimbs slammed into the steel, the impact jarring his arms to the shoulder. It was immensely strong. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the commune, followed by shouting. A different kind of shouting, angry, human. Jade's blood ran cold. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The back wall of the snack shack, the cinder block wall Jinx had marked on her map, had a gaping hole in it. Dark figures were pouring through. The rust dogs. It wasn't an ambush. It was a coordinated attack. This thing, this monster, it was a diversion or a coincidence. A horribly, impossibly timed coincidence. The gutter gorgon hissed and lunged again. Jade was trapped. In front of him was a monster from a nightmare. Behind him, his home was being invaded. A heavy chunk of concrete flew past his head and smashed into the creature's flank. "Jade, get back here." It was Grizz's voice, a deep-throated roar. He was standing on the wall, another piece of rubble in his hands. Jade didn't need to be told twice. He feinted a swing at the creature, forcing it to hesitate, then turned and scrambled back toward the wall, his boots slipping on the wet ground. Grizz reached down a massive hand and hauled him over the top just as the gutter gorgon slammed into the concrete barrier, its claws scraping uselessly at the stone. The scene inside the camp was chaos. Breaker, Cormac's silent giant, stood in the hole he'd made in the wall, a huge sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. He was a human wall, preventing anyone from getting out. Cormac himself stood near the center of the camp, a cruel smile on his face, his pointed rebar held loosely in his hand. Mags and Ratchet were smashing what little the commune had, overturning their water barrels, kicking over the fire pit. But the real focus of the attack was the infirmary. Twitch, his body vibrating with nervous energy, was frantically stuffing Marisol's precious medical supplies into a sack. Marisol was trying to stop him, her sharpened kitchen knife in her hand, but Jinx stood between them. Jinx moved with a coiled, serpentine grace, a long, thin blade of her own held in a reverse grip. She wasn't attacking Marisol, just blocking her, her eyes cold and watchful. "Jedediah, glad you could join the party," Cormac called out, his voice full of mock cheer. "We're just collecting a tax, a health and wellness tax, you understand." Jade's rage was a white-hot fire. "Get out of my camp, Cormac." "This isn't your camp," Cormac sneered, taking a step forward. "Nothing in this park is yours. It all belongs to the strong. And right now you are looking decidedly weak." He gestured with his head toward the wall. "You even have a stray dog problem." Outside the wall, the gutter gorgon was still scratching and hissing, trying to find a way in. A horrifying, rhythmic banging started as it began to throw its body against the concrete. "What is that thing?" Jinx asked, her cold gaze flickering toward the sound, her composure wavering for the first time. "The park's janitor," Jade spat, his eyes locked on Cormac. "It's here to take out the trash." He charged. He didn't have a plan. He was running on pure adrenaline and rage. He saw Cormac's grin widen. This is what he wanted, a fight. Jade swung his pipe, aiming for Cormac's head. Cormac was fast, deflecting the blow with his rebar, the clang of metal on metal echoing through the camp. They exchanged a furious series of blows, their weapons a blur of motion. Jade was stronger, but Cormac was quicker and more skilled. He fought with a dirty, street-honed efficiency. From across the camp, Grizz let out a roar and charged Breaker. The two giants met with the force of a car crash, their heavy weapons swinging. The sounds of their battle were like a forge, all grunts and percussive impacts. Marisol saw her chance. With Jinx distracted by the monster outside, she lunged at Twitch. Twitch shrieked and dropped his sack, scrambling away from her flashing knife. Marisol stood over her recovered supplies, her chest heaving, her eyes daring anyone else to come near. The standoff was a chaotic tableau of violence. Jade versus Cormac, Grizz versus Breaker, Marisol guarding her territory, and all the while the relentless thump, thump, thump of the gutter gorgon against the outside wall provided a horrifying beat. Cormac kicked a loose crate into Jade's path, making him stumble. He brought the point of his rebar up in a vicious thrust. Jade twisted at the last second, and the sharpened metal sliced through the fabric of his slicker and dug a deep, burning furrow along his ribs. He cried out, staggering back. "It's over, Builder," Cormac hissed, advancing on him. "Give up." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. A high, unearthly wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the park's emergency broadcast system, still somehow functional after all these years. But the sound wasn't an alarm. It was a voice. A distorted, childlike voice, warped by decay and static. "Captain Splash says the park is now closed. Please gather your belongings. The park is now closed. A fee. Aiding time at the Kraken's maw is now closed." The voice belonged to the hermit Cappy, broadcasting from somewhere in the park. The message was a garbled, nonsensical loop, but one word cut through the static and hung in the air. Feeding. The gutter gorgon outside the wall stopped its banging. It let out a series of high-pitched clicks and hisses, as if answering a call. Then, with a final, furious scrape of claws, Its sounds began to recede as it moved away from the wall. Cormac and Jinx exchanged a look. Their clean, simple raid had spiraled into a chaotic brawl with an unknown monster thrown into the mix. This wasn't their plan. "Grab the sack," Cormac yelled at Twitch. "We're leaving." Jinx disengaged from her standoff with Marisol, her eyes still scanning the darkness outside the camp. Twitch scurried forward, snatched the bag of stolen medicine, and retreated toward the hole in the wall. Breaker slammed his hammer into Grizz's shoulder, forcing the big man back, and followed. Cormac gave Jade one last look, a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. He backed away, joining his crew as they slipped back out into the night. Jade clutched his bleeding side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He watched them go, his body screaming with pain, his mind reeling. They had won. Or more accurately, they hadn't lost, not completely. The rust dogs were gone, but they had taken a significant portion of their medical supplies. And worse, they all now knew about the real threat. The creature in the park was real, and Cappy's insane broadcast confirmed his deepest fear. It wasn't just one. The way it reacted to the word feeding. It was being called. He stumbled over to the wall and peered over. The night was empty. The creature was gone, but the silence it left behind was more terrifying than the noise had been. Where did it go? And what exactly was happening at the Kraken's maw? The war for Splashdown Kingdom had just begun, but Jade had the sickening feeling that both the commune and the rust dogs were no longer the primary combatants. They were just the food. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. The silence that followed the rust dog's retreat was heavier than the chaos it replaced. It pressed in on the members of the commune, a physical weight of failure and fear. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain, the ragged, pained breaths of Jedediah Cole, and the distant, insane loop of Cappy's broadcast fading in and out on the wind. "Park is now closed. Feeding time. Closed." Jade was on one knee, his hand clamped to the burning gash in his side. Dark, warm blood seeped between his fingers, slick and alarming. He watched the hole Breaker had punched in their wall, a jagged black mouth that had vomited violence into their home. The illusion of safety, so carefully constructed over months of vigilance, had been shattered in minutes. Marisol was at his side instantly, her face a mask of grim focus. "Don't move. Let me see." Her hands were firm and steady as she peeled his blood-soaked shirt away from the wound. Jade hissed in pain as the fabric pulled at the raw flesh. The cut was long and deep, running from his lower ribs toward his hip. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was bad. In this world, any wound was bad. "Grizz," Marisol's voice was sharp, cutting through the daze that had fallen over the camp. "Get him inside, on the counter, now." The big man lumbered over, his face bruised and his breathing heavy from his clash with Breaker. He gently, but with immense strength, hooked an arm under Jade and lifted him to his feet. Jade gritted his teeth, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He leaned on Grizz, allowing himself to be half-carried into the snack shack, now a scene of violation and disarray. They laid him on the cold, stainless steel counter where Marisol kept her supplies. The cold of the metal shocked his system, clearing his head slightly. The rest of the commune huddled nearby, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering lamplight. Kyra was trying to comfort a whimpering Mama Odette. Ben stood uselessly, his hands clenching and unclenching. Finch looked like he was about to vibrate apart. And Pip was sitting on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, his body trembling uncontrollably as he stared at the far wall, his eyes seeing things that were no longer there. "Water," Marisol commanded, not looking at anyone in particular. "Boiled, and all the clean rags we have." Ben scurried to obey, his movements clumsy with panic. Marisol worked with a practiced, detached efficiency that Jade was profoundly grateful for. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle for someone whose expression was so severe. Every dab of the antiseptic-soaked rag sent a fresh bolt of fire through Jade's side. "It's deep," she said, her voice low so only he could hear. "It missed anything vital, I think, but it's going to get infected if we don't clean it properly. Cormac's weapons aren't exactly sterile." She looked at the pathetic collection of medical supplies Twitch hadn't managed to steal. They took most of the antibiotics, all the strong ones. Jade swore under his breath, a raw, angry sound. "How much do we have left?" "Enough for a few days, if we're lucky." She began to stitch the wound, her movements quick and precise with a needle and thread she'd sterilized in the flame of a lighter. Jade stared at the grime-caked ceiling, focusing on a spider web in the corner, anything to distract him from the searing pain of the needle piercing his skin. "Talk to me, Pip," Jade said, his voice strained. He needed to know. He needed to understand the new variable in their grim equation. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Pip flinched at the sound of his name. He looked over at Jade, his young face a wreck of trauma. He started to speak, his voice a choked whisper. He told them about the tunnel, the smell, the greasy trail. He described the dissolved bones of the rats. His voice cracked as he recounted the sound in the pipe, the slow, heavy, sliding sound. I dropped my light," he stammered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It rolled and the light hit the water. This flooded part of the tunnel, it woke up." Finch made a small, strangled noise. Marisol didn't stop her stitching, but her knuckles were white. Pip described the creature, the gutter gorgon, in horrifying, fragmented detail. The eyeless head, the translucent skin, the waving feelers, the mouth. He choked on the word, unable to properly describe the black, pulsating hole. "It came after me. I just ran." "You did good, Pip," Jade said, his voice rough. "You got away, you warned us." "It was fast," Pip whispered, shaking his head. "So fast, I didn't think anything that big could move so fast." "The broadcast," Jade said, looking at Marisol. "Cappy, he called it off." Marisol finished her last stitch and tied off the thread. She began bandaging the wound tightly. "The feeding time part, what does it mean?" Before anyone could answer, Mama Odette, who had been humming quietly, spoke in a voice as clear and lucid as a church bell. "They feed the greats, always have." Everyone turned to stare at her. The old woman looked back at them, her eyes cloudy but focused. "When my pappy worked here when they first built this place, the water never stayed clean," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "The filters kept breaking. So the owners, the men from the city, they found an older way. The land here, it's marshland. It has its own drains. They diverted the water, fed the greats, made a deal with the things that lived in the muck." Finch let out a shaky laugh. What are you talking about? Fed them what? Mama Odette's gaze was unsettling. Trash at first, spoiled food from the kitchens, stray animals, anything to keep the water clear for the tourists. They called it purifying the system. My pappy called it paying the toll. A thick, heavy silence filled the snack shack. The old woman's dementia-fueled ramblings, once dismissed as harmless nonsense, now carried the chilling weight of prophecy. The gutter gorgon wasn't an invasive species. It was a native. It was part of the park's very infrastructure. And Cappy, the broken man who once wore the mascot's smiling face, seemed to understand its rhythms. Jade pushed himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the sharp protest from his side. The Kraken's maw, the wave pool, that's where it went. Feeding time at the Kraken's maw. We stay away from there, Grizz rumbled from the corner where he was nursing his bruised shoulder. We have our own problems. He gestured with his head toward the gaping hole in the wall. That hole is our problem, Jade countered, his voice gaining strength. And so is that thing. We fought them both off tonight by sheer dumb luck. Luck runs out. We can't just sit here and wait for one of them to finish us. Cormac will be back, and that thing, it knows we're here. So what do? Ben asked, his voice trembling slightly. We can't fight that monster, you saw it. Your pipe barely scratched it. We don't have to fight it, Jade said, his mind working, clicking past the pain. We have to understand it. We need to know what it is, how many there are, how it hunts. We need to know what a feeding looks like. Knowledge is a weapon. Right now, it's the only one we have that they don't. You want someone to go out there, Finch squeaked, his eyes wide with horror. To the wave pool after what Pip saw, you're insane. I'm not insane, I'm trying to keep us alive, Jade shot back, his voice a low growl. Sitting here and patching walls is a slow death. We have to be smarter, we have to know the terrain, all of it. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on Pip. The boy flinched, curling deeper into his blanket. Jade's heart went out to him, but he had to push. Pip, you're the only one who has seen it up close. You're the only one who got away from it. I'm not going back out there, Pip whispered, his voice shaking. Don't ask me to. Jade softened his tone. I'm not asking you to fight it. I'm asking you to use your skills. You're the best scout we have. The quietest. You know the tunnels better than anyone. I need you to just look, from a distance. See what's there. See what feeding time means. The small shelter was silent save for the rain outside. The weight of Jade's request hung in the air. He was asking a traumatized boy to face his monster again. It was a terrible thing to ask, but it was necessary. The reckoning had come. The old rules of survival, hunker down, stay quiet, defend the walls, were obsolete. The game had changed. They had to learn the new rules or they would be wiped from the board. Marisol finished tying off the bandage on his side. Her expression was unreadable. She knew what he was doing, what he was asking, and she knew he was right. She picked up a small, sealed tin from her remaining supplies. Take this, she said, handing it to Pip. It was a tin of high-energy survival rations, a rare prize they had been saving. For the trip. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of support, a quiet acknowledgement that their survival depended on the courage of their youngest member. Pip looked from the tin in his hand to Jade's grim, determined face. He was terrified, but beneath the terror a small, hard kernel of something else was forming. He had survived. He had escaped a monster. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a sliver of angry pride. This was his park, too. He nodded, a single, jerky motion. Jade let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good lad. You don't go alone, and you don't go until you're ready." He knew the mission was a death sentence waiting to happen, but it was a chance, and chances were all they had left. The hole in the wall was a constant reminder of their vulnerability, but the true threat wasn't the hole. It was their ignorance of the darkness that now surrounded them. Chapter 6. A Map of Monsters. The reek of blood and antiseptic filled the engine room. Cormac paced the concrete floor, his bare feet making soft, slapping sounds in the gloom. His rage was a living thing, a hot coal in his chest. The raid Jinx's clean and efficient plan had been a disaster. They'd gotten some supplies, yes, but the cost was too high. Mags was laid out on a dirty mattress, her face pale with sweat as Jinx worked on the gash in her leg. Ratchet was nursing a broken hand, courtesy of Grizz's wrench. And the entire crew had seen it. They had seen the creature from the tunnels, and they had seen Cormac, their fearless leader, forced into a tactical retreat. He hated it. He hated the fear he could now smell on his own people, mingling with the ever-present stench of ozone and damp. He hated the new variable, the monster that didn't play by his rules. Most of all, he hated the memory of the look on Jedediah's face, not of defeat, but of defiance. "Talk to me, Jinx," Cormac said, his voice a low growl. He stopped his packing and loomed over her. Jinx didn't look up from stitching Mags's leg. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. "It's a biological entity. Amphibious from the look of it, it's a predator. Hunts by vibration and, I suspect, scent. Its hide is thick, resistant to blunt force trauma. It is fast in a straight line but not agile." Cormac grunted. "I'm not looking for a bestiary entry. I want to know how we kill it." "We don't," Jinx said simply, tying off a suture. "We avoid it. It's part of the park's ecosystem. We are the invasive species. The question is not how to kill it. The question is, how does it live? What does it eat? And why did it appear tonight?" She finally looked at him, her pale eyes holding a clinical, unnerving calm. The hermit's broadcast was not a coincidence. Feeding time at the Kraken's maw. The creature responded to it. That implies a conditioned response. It implies a routine. Cormac's mind raced. He remembered seeing Cappy on the slide tower earlier. The broken man knew things. Things Cormac didn't. The thought was galling. "So the ghost is the beast's master," he sneered. "Unlikely," Jinx said, wiping her needle on a rag. "A trigger, perhaps, or just an observer who understands the schedule. The old woman in Jade's camp, the one they call Mama. I've heard my people talking about her. They say she spouts nonsense about the park's history. Perhaps her nonsense is worth listening to now." Breaker, who had been sitting silently in the corner, let out a low grunt and pointed toward the main entrance of the engine room. Everyone tensed. A lone figure was approaching, moving with a jerky, hesitant gait. It was Twitch. He'd been sent to scout the perimeter after their retreat, to make sure nothing had followed them. Twitch stumbled into the light of the generator, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of his usual drug-fueled paranoia and fresh terror. "They're still there," he rasped, wringing his hands. "The sheep, hiding in their little pen, but the big thing, it's gone." "Where did it go, Twitch?" Cormac asked, stepping into his path. "Toward the wave pool," Twitch said, his voice dropping. "I heard it, moving through the pipes under the ground. It was going to the place the crazy man said. The Kraken's maw." He shivered. "There are other sounds, too, from the drains, wet sounds. Things are moving tonight, all over the park." Cormac looked at Jinx. Her expression was grim. This confirmed her theory. The wave pool was the key. It was the creature's lair or its feeding ground. It was the heart of this new darkness. "We need to see it," Cormac said, a sudden, hard certainty in his voice. The fear in the room was a poison. The only antidote was action. He had to reclaim the narrative, to re-establish himself as the one who faced the dark, not the one who ran from it. "We need to see what a feeding looks like." A murmur of unease went through the gathered rust dogs. "That's suicide," Mags grunted from her mattress, her voice tight with pain. "We don't know what's there." "Then we will find out," Cormac snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He walked to the center of the room, his presence dominating the space. "We came here because the world outside is dead. We survived because we are stronger than the sheep. We are not afraid of the dark. We are not afraid of stories told by old women and lunatics. There is a new predator in our territory. We will learn its ways, and then we will learn how to use it, or we will learn how to kill it. Either way, we face it. We do not hide from it." His charisma was a tangible force. He could feel the fear in the room begin to recede, replaced by a harder, more aggressive energy. They were dogs and they needed a master. He would be that master. "Jinx," he commanded, "you have the best eyes, you and I will go. We'll take the high ground, the top of the tsunami slides. It gives us a clear view of the entire wave pool. We'll be ghosts, in and out." Jinx nodded slowly, a flicker of something, respect, or perhaps just cold calculation in her eyes. "Breaker should come, for security." Cormac agreed. "Breaker comes. The rest of you stay here, bar the entrance. If we are not back by sunrise, this place is yours." He looked directly at Mags as he said it, a clear challenge. They prepared in silence, gathering their weapons and the single pair of high-powered binoculars they scavenged from a park security office. Cormac felt the familiar, exhilarating hum of adrenaline returning. This was what he was made for. Not a messy brawl with farmers and mechanics, but a tense, dangerous stalk into the heart of enemy territory. As they were about to leave, Cormac stopped and walked over to Twitch. The smaller man flinched away. Cormac put a hand on his shoulder, his grip like steel. "That thing you saw tonight, Twitch, the one that came out of the tunnel, it came from Jade's side of the park," Cormac said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "The sheep have a guard dog we didn't know about. Maybe they led it to us. Maybe this was their trap." It was a lie, a seed of poison planted to redirect the fear, to twist the narrative to his advantage. Twitch's eyes widened as the idea took root. The monster wasn't a random horror. It was an enemy weapon. The sheep weren't so helpless after all. "Go tell the others," Cormac said, releasing him. Tell them what the sheep are capable of." Twitch nodded eagerly and scurried off to spread the new gospel. Cormac smirked. Fear was a tool like any other. You just had to know how to aim it. He, Jinx, and Breaker slipped out of the engine room and into the damp, oppressive dark of the park. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with moisture, every sound muffled and close. They moved like shadows, avoiding the open pathways, sticking to the crumbling facades of the abandoned concession stands and game booths. Their destination, the Tsunami Slide Tower, was one of the tallest structures in the park, a triple stack of open-air body slides that loomed over the Kraken's Maw Wave pool. The climb was treacherous, the metal stairs slick with algae and rust. Breaker went first, testing each step with his immense weight. Jinx followed and Cormac came last, his rebar held ready, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. They reached the top platform, a wide metal grate nearly 100 feet in the air. The view was commanding. Below them, the massive, fan-shaped basin of the wave pool spread out like a dead sea. The deep end, near the wave-generating wall, was filled with a thick black liquid that didn't look like water. It was too viscous, and it pulsed with a faint, internal phosphorescence. The bottom of the pool wasn't concrete. It was coated in a thick, pulsating layer of what looked like organic matter, a carpet of gristle and fungus that glowed with the same sickly green light. And in the center of the deep end, the primary drainage grate, a huge, circular iron plate, was slowly, rhythmically opening and closing like the valve of a monstrous heart. Jinx raised the binoculars, her hands perfectly steady. Cormac stared, his bravado momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, primal awe. This was no longer just a park. It was a nest. "What do you see?" Cormac whispered. Jinx was silent for a long moment. "Bones," she finally said, her voice a strained rasp. "Hundreds of them, animal bones mostly. They're sticking out of the sludge, and movement under the surface, many movements." As they watched, a sound echoed across the pool, the gurgling, clicking hiss of the gutter gorgon. They saw it emerge from a massive overflow drain at the side of the pool, the same creature Jade had fought. It slipped into the viscous liquid and began to swim toward the central grate, its pale body a stark contrast to the black sludge. Then another one came, and another, 3 of them all converging on the central grate, which was now fully open, pulsing with an inviting green light. They weren't fighting. They were gathering. And then from the depths of the grate something began to rise. It wasn't another creature. It was food. A huge, amorphous mass of biological matter pushed up from the filtration system below. It was a slurry of half-dissolved animals, park trash, and other things Cormac couldn't identify, all bound together in a thick, gelatinous blob. The gutter gorgons fell upon it, their lipless mouths opening, tearing at the grotesque offering with a quiet, efficient hunger. This was the feeding. This was the park's secret, a grotesque, self-sustaining ecosystem of horror. Cormac felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. Jedediah didn't have a guard dog. He lived next to a dragon's den. They all did. Suddenly, Breaker grunted and tapped Cormac's shoulder, pointing not down at the pool, but to the far side, near the base of the sea serpent slides. Jinx swung the binoculars in that direction. "Company," she hissed. Cormac strained his eyes. He saw them. Two small figures moving low and fast, slipping out of a maintenance hatch. One of them was small and wiry, the other taller, Jade's people. They were scouting just like his team was. One of them, the smaller one, was pointing toward the wave pool, his posture radiating terror even from this distance. It was the boy, the one whose scream had started all of this. A cold, vicious smile spread across Cormac's face. The fear was gone, replaced by a surge of predatory glee. The sheep had sent their lambs out to scout the wolves' den. A perfect opportunity. "They're trapped," Cormac whispered, his voice full of savage joy. "The monsters are in front of them, and we are behind them. Jinx, give me the binoculars. Let's get a better look at our guests." He was no longer just mapping the monsters. He was hunting the men. Chapter 7. The Whispering Water. Fear was a taste in Pip's mouth, coppery and sharp like an old penny. Every shadow in the maintenance tunnel was a lurking monster. Every drip of water was the footstep of the thing that haunted his waking and sleeping thoughts. He had not wanted to come back here, but Jade's face, tight with pain and grim resolve, had been more compelling than his own terror. That and the look in Marisol's eyes as she handed him the tin of rations. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of trust. That was heavier than any fear. He wasn't alone. Kyra was with him. Jade had chosen her for her quiet composure and steady hand. She and Ben had always been on the periphery, the campers trying to maintain a life that no longer existed. But after the raid, something in Kyra had hardened. When Jade asked for a volunteer, her hand went up without hesitation, her expression firm. Ben had tried to protest, but she had silenced him with a single, sharp look. They moved in silence, Pip in the lead, his small flashlight used sparingly, its beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. He led them through a different set of tunnels, avoiding the one where he'd had his encounter. He could feel Kyra's presence behind him, a steady, calming anchor in the oppressive dark. Their destination was a small, long-forgotten utility closet at the base of the Sea Serpent Slide Tower. According to Jade's hand-drawn maps of the park, its grated window offered a concealed, ground-level view of the Kraken's maw. It was as close as anyone could safely get. "Here," Pip whispered, his voice sounding loud in the silence. He pushed open a rusted metal door which groaned in protest. The closet was tiny, smelling of mold and ancient, dried-out chemicals. It was filled with rotting bags of pool salts and discarded cleaning equipment. A small, grated window, thick with grime and cobwebs, was set high in the far wall. Pip stood on an overturned bucket and carefully wiped a small section of the grate clean. His breath hitched in his throat. The view was horrifying. From this low angle, the wave pool looked like a festering wound in the earth. The pulsating, phosphorescent fungus that carpeted the bottom cast a sickly green glow on the scene. The black, viscous liquid in the deep end churned slowly, thick bubbles of methane popping on its surface. And the remains. There were hundreds of bones, mostly small animals, sticking out of the sludge like grotesque grave markers. But there were larger bones, too, ribcage that were too big for a dog or a deer. A shape that looked horribly like a human jawbone. "What is it?" Kyra whispered from below him. "It's their nest," Pip breathed, his voice trembling, "or their dinner plate." As they watched, a sound reached them, a low gurgling that vibrated through the concrete floor. From a large drain set into the side of the pool, one of the gutter gorgons emerged. It slid into the black water with a quiet splash. Then another and another. Pip counted 3 of them, all swimming with a slow, sinuous grace toward the center of the pool. "They're gathering," Kyra said, having climbed onto another bucket to see for herself. Her voice was steady, but Pip could see the tension in her knuckles as she gripped the wall. Suddenly, the central drain, the one Mama Odette had spoken of, began to move. With a deep, groaning sound, the iron grate retracted, and a truly foul mass of rotting organic matter was pushed up from below. The feeding had begun. The creatures fell upon the offering with a quiet, horrifying efficiency. Pip felt a wave of nausea. This was the park's secret engine, a cycle of rot and consumption. This was the purification system. He understood now. The park wasn't just built on a swamp. The park was the swamp given a smiling plastic face. He was about to pull back from the window, having seen more than enough, when Kyra grabbed his arm. "Wait," she hissed. "Look up there." She was pointing toward the top of the tsunami slide tower on the far side of the pool. Pip followed her gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement. 3 figures silhouetted against the slightly less dark night sky. They were too far away to make out faces, but their shapes were unmistakable. One was massive and broad-shouldered. The other 2 were leaner, rust dogs. "Cormac," Pip whispered, the name tasting like poison. They were watching just like he and Kyra were. The realization sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. They were caught, not between a rock and a hard place, but between 2 different kinds of monsters. "We have to go," Kyra said, her voice urgent and low. "Now, before they see us." They scrambled out of the utility closet, their hearts pounding in unison. They didn't run back the way they came. That tunnel was too long, too direct. Pip made a split-second decision, pulling Kyra toward a smaller, intersecting passage. "This way," he urged. "It's tighter, but it leads back toward the lazy river. It'll be faster." This new tunnel was more of a crawl space, forcing them to crouch as they moved. The air was stagnant and thick. The floor was covered in a layer of fine, silty mud, and it was wet. A trickle of water flowed down the center of the passage, originating from a series of small drainage grates that lined the floor, grates that connected to the lazy river. Pip's skin crawled. He remembered the sludge spawn Marisol had described from a story another squatter had told her long ago, leech-like things that lived in the sludge. He pushed the thought away and focused on moving forward. They moved as quickly as they could, their movements clumsy in the confined space. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the soft squelch of their shoes in the mud. They passed one of the floor grates. The water flowing from it seemed thicker here, darker. Suddenly, Kyra gasped and stumbled, falling to one knee. "My foot," she grunted. "It's stuck." Pip swung his flashlight back. Kyra's boot was submerged in a deep patch of the thick, silty mud near a grate. She was trying to pull it free, but it wouldn't budge. "It's like quicksand," she said, her voice tight with rising panic. Pip knelt beside her, shining his light into the muck. The mud was unnaturally thick and sticky. He grabbed her arm and pulled. On 3, 1, 2, 3. They both heaved, and her foot came free with a loud, wet, sucking sound. But she wasn't free. Something was attached to her boot. It was a glistening black mass, the size of a dinner plate. It had the texture of a slug, but it was covered in dozens of tiny, writhing tendrils that had anchored it to the thick rubber of her boot. It wasn't a single organism. It was a writhing colony of smaller, fist-sized leech-like things, all clustered together. A sludge spawn. Kyra let out a small, terrified cry and kicked her leg frantically, trying to shake it off. The mass held fast. "Don't move," Pip yelled, his mind racing. He remembered what Marisol had said. They drained heat. He grabbed his knife, the small, sharp blade Jade had given him for scavenging. He couldn't stab it without risking hitting Kyra's leg. He had an idea. He grabbed his flashlight. It was a cheap plastic thing, but the bulb got hot if you left it on. He pressed the hot lens of the light directly against the pulsating mass. The colony reacted instantly. It recoiled from the heat, the entire mass seeming to contract. It let out a high-pitched, collective hiss, a sound like air leaking from a tire. A few of the individual leeches dropped off, writhing in the mud. He pressed harder. The smell of burning rubber and something foully organic filled the small tunnel. With a final, violent shudder, the main mass detached from her boot and fell into the sludge with a wet plop. It writhed for a moment, then sunk beneath the surface, disappearing into the muck. Kyra was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, her hand pressed to her chest. "Thank you," she breathed. "Gods, thank you." They didn't wait. They scrambled the rest of the way through the crawl space, their earlier caution thrown to the wind. They burst out of a maintenance hatch into the familiar territory of the lazy river, not stopping until they were on the commune's side of the border. They collapsed behind the cover of a tilted, defunct log flume, their chests heaving. They were safe, for now. They had the information Jade wanted. They knew what happened at the feeding, but they also had new, more terrifying knowledge. They knew Cormac and his crew had seen it too, and they knew the tunnels, their secret highways through the park, were not safe. The park's horrors weren't confined to the wave pool. They were in the water, all of the water. Pip looked at Kyra, who was staring down at her boot. The rubber was pitted and slightly melted where the sludge spawn had attached itself. She had been lucky, incredibly lucky. The balance of power in the park had shifted. It was no longer just the commune versus the rust dogs with a monster in the background. Now both factions knew about the horrors lurking in the park's heart, and both factions knew the other was watching. The Cold War was over. The game had become infinitely more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Every shadow could hold a rust dog. Every puddle could hold a monster. There was no safe ground left. Chapter 8: The Price of Knowledge. The storm that had been brewing inside Jade's mind finally broke. He sat on the edge of the grimy counter in the snack shack, the pain in his side a dull, constant throb, listening as Pip and Kyra delivered their report. Every word, every horrifying detail, was another nail in the coffin of his old strategy. Pip, his voice steadier now but still laced with trauma, described the wave pool, the fungal carpet, the viscous black water, the slurry of bones. Kyra, her own fear locked down behind a mask of cold fury, recounted the sighting of Cormac's crew on the tsunami tower. She finished by describing their encounter in the tunnel, pulling up her boot to show them all the puckered, melted patch on the rubber where the sludge spawn had latched on. A heavy, terrified silence fell over the small group gathered in the shack. Finch looked physically ill. Grizz's hand was clenched around the head of his wrench, his knuckles white. "So they know," Jade said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "Cormac saw the feeding, he saw the creatures, and he saw you." "I don't think they saw us," Pip said quickly. "We were in the shadows. They were looking down at the pool." "Don't count on it," Jade growled. "Cormac doesn't miss things like that. Assume he saw you. Assume he knows we're scouting him. What does that give him?" Marisol, who had been quietly cleaning her medical instruments, answered without looking up. "It gives him an advantage. He knows we're afraid. He knows we're probing the creature's territory. He might think we're trying to find a way to use them against him." "Can we?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was naive, born of desperation, but it hung in the air. "Use them?" Jade scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Did you listen to what they said? There are at least 3 of the big ones, and the water is full of those leech things. The park is their territory. We're just living in a corner of it. Trying to use them would be like trying to weaponize a hurricane. It'll destroy you long before it ever hurts your enemy." He pushed himself off the counter, packing the small space, the movement pulling at the stitches in his side. His mind was a whirlwind. Cormac knew that was the critical fact. The fear of the unknown monster which might have created a temporary, unspoken truce was gone. Now it was a race for knowledge, a race for control. Cormac wasn't the type to be scared off. He was the type to see a new, bigger predator and try to become it, or tame it. "He'll be back," Jade said, thinking aloud. "He won't risk a direct assault on us again, not right away. He'll be smarter now. He'll try to pick us off one by one when we're scavenging. He'll try to cut us off from our resources. And he'll be watching us, trying to learn what we know." The hole in their wall seemed to mock him. It was a symbol of his failure, of their weakness. "Grizz, Ben, I want that hole sealed. Now. Use everything we have, scrap metal, busted furniture, fill it with concrete rubble if you have to. I want it stronger than the original wall." The 2 men nodded and moved to obey, glad for a physical task to distract them from the creeping dread. Jade turned to the others. "From now on, no one goes out alone, ever. All scavenging runs are in groups of 3. 1 to work, 2 to watch. And we stay out of the tunnels, all of them. They belong to the creatures now. We'll have to take the long way around, out in the open. It's more dangerous from the rust dogs, but it's better than stumbling into one of those things in the dark." His new orders were met with grim, silent nods. The price of their new knowledge was freedom. Their world had just shrunk, their cage made smaller. As if on cue, a sudden, loud commotion from outside the shack sent everyone scrambling for their weapons. It was a series of frantic shouts, followed by a metallic crash. Jade grabbed his pipe, his side screaming in protest, and moved to the entrance. It wasn't an attack. It was Ratchet, one of Cormac's rust dogs, stumbling out of the darkness near the lazy river. He was alone and he was terrified. He was clutching his arm and his face was a mask of pain and panic. He tripped and fell, scrambling backward on the ground, away from the darkness he'd just emerged from. "Help me," he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Gods help me." Behind him, another figure appeared, Jinx. She moved with her usual lethal grace, but she wasn't attacking Ratchet. She was dragging someone. It was Twitch. His body was limp, and a dark stain was spreading across his jacket. Jade's group froze, weapons raised, caught in a tense standoff. Jinx stopped just on the other side of the algae-choked canal that marked their border. She let go of Twitch, who collapsed into a heap. "Truce!" Jinx yelled, her voice strained. She held up her empty hands. "We need a doctor." Cormac and Breaker emerged from the shadows behind her. Cormac was not smiling. His face was a thunderous mask of fury. His rebar was dripping with the same black, viscous fluid that had leaked from the gutter gorgon. "What happened to him?" Marisol called out, taking a step forward before Jade put a hand on her arm to stop her. "One of your pets," Cormac snarled, his voice venomous. He kicked at a nearby rock with frustrated rage. "We were scouting. One of those things from the water. It came out of a drain, got him." Jinx elaborated, her voice clipped and professional. "A colony organism. Thermivoric, it attached to his leg. We got it off, but he's in shock and his core temperature is dropping rapidly. Your medic knows what they are." It was a statement, not a question. She was referencing the knowledge Kyra and Pip had just brought back. She was confirming that they knew they had been watched. "Why should we help you?" Jade asked, his voice cold. "You tried to kill us not 2 hours ago." "Because if you don't, I will kill him myself right now," Cormac threatened, pointing his rebar at Twitch's still form. "And then I will come across this river and kill all of you. Slowly. Or," he took a breath, forcing a calmer tone, "you help him and you get something in return." "What could you possibly offer us?" Jade shot back. "Information," Jinx answered before Cormac could. "We saw something you didn't from the tower. There's a pattern to the creature's behavior, a weakness. We'll trade you knowledge for medical aid." Jade hesitated. It was a trap, it had to be. But one look at Twitch's pale, clammy skin told him the man was dying, and the offer of information, a weakness. It was a prize he couldn't afford to ignore. This was the new currency of the park. Not food, not weapons, but knowledge. The price of that knowledge was a risk. A terrible, immediate risk. "Bring him to the edge of the water," Marisol said, making the decision for him. "Leave his weapons, back away. I'll see what I can do." Jade looked at her, about to object, but she met his gaze with a look of steel. This was her domain. He nodded slowly. Cormac and Jinx looked at each other. They had no choice. They dragged the moaning Twitch to the edge of the canal. Marisol, carrying her bag, walked to her own side, putting 20 feet of murky, monster-infested water between them. The truce was fragile, a spider's thread stretched taut over a chasm of hatred and fear. The two tribes, enemies just hours ago, were now locked in a tense, unwilling negotiation, forced together by the greater horror that claimed the park as its own. Jade watched Cormac's eyes, saw the fury and humiliation simmering there, and knew that whatever information they offered, whatever temporary peace they brokered, it would be paid for. The price of knowledge was high, and it was often paid in blood. Chapter 9: The Devil's Bargain. The air over the lazy river was thick with unspoken threats. It was a no-man's land, a liquid border between two warring factions, and now it was the site of the most dangerous parley Jedediah had ever imagined. On the far bank, Cormac stood like a statue carved from hate, his rebar held loosely at his side. Jinx was a coiled spring of readiness, her eyes missing nothing. On the ground between them, Twitch moaned, his body shivering violently despite the humid air. On the commune's side, Marisol knelt, her medical bag open beside her. She wasn't looking at Cormac or Jinx. Her entire focus was on the injured man across the water. His gear, Marisol said, her voice sharp and clear, carrying across the murky canal. Take it off him, all of it. The jacket, the boots. They'll hold the cold. Get him down to a single layer. Cormac sneered. You're not in a position to give orders, medic. I'm in the position to save his life, Marisol shot back without missing a beat. Those things are thermivores. They don't just suck heat. Their slime actively lowers the temperature of whatever it touches. His wet clothes are a death sentence. Get them off him or I walk away. Jinx, ever the pragmatist, didn't hesitate. She knelt and began stripping Twitch's soaked jacket off him with rough efficiency. Cormac watched for a moment, his jaw tight, before grudgingly helping her pull off the man's heavy boots. Twitch's skin underneath was pale and bluish, his shivering growing more erratic. Now what which? Cormac growled. I need to get his core temperature up. Fast, Marisol explained, speaking as if she were dictating a procedure. You have a fire, get him next to it. Wrap him in anything you have that's dry. Blankets, tarps, anything. And you need to get warm liquids into him. Broth, hot water, whatever you've got. Slowly, don't let him gulp it down. Jade watched the exchange, his hand tight on his pipe. This was wrong. They were helping their enemy. Every piece of advice Marisol gave was another chance for Cormac's man to survive, to come back and try to kill them another day. But he also saw the cold necessity of it, the information Jinx had offered, a weakness in the creatures. That was a prize worth this bitter medicine. We're holding up our end, Jade called out, his voice a low rumble. Now it's your turn, the information. Jinx stood up, wiping her hands on her trousers. She looked at Cormac, who gave a curt, angry nod. The broadcast, Jinx said, her voice flat. The one from the hermit, it wasn't just a trigger for the feeding. It was a repellent. Jade and his group exchanged confused glances. A repellent, Jade repeated. It called the things, we all saw it. It called the big ones, Jinx clarified, her eyes locking with Jade's. The gutter gorgons, it called them to the maw, but while that broadcast was playing, the smaller things, the ones in the water, the sludge spawn, they went dormant. They retreated into the drains. We saw it from the tower. The muck in the tunnels your scout was in, it went still. The moment the broadcast started. A stunned silence fell over the commune's side of the river. The noise, Cappy's insane, looping broadcast, it was a key, a weapon, not a powerful one but a subtle one, a way to make some of the paths safer if only for a short time. Why? Kyra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would it affect them differently? Frequency, Jinx answered, a hint of grudging respect in her tone. The broadcast is a mess of static and layered noise. There must be a specific audio frequency mixed in there, something high-pitched or subsonic that disrupts the smaller organisms. The larger ones are either immune to it, or it serves a different purpose for them. A summons. Jade's mind reeled with the implications. Cappy wasn't just a broken man. He was the keeper of the park's secrets. He understood the ecosystem. He knew how to ring the dinner bell for the dragons and scare away the piranhas. He was the most important person in Splashdown Kingdom. "How do we use it?" Jade asked, the question feeling like a betrayal of his own principles. Cormac let out a harsh laugh. "That's the beautiful part, Builder. You can't. The broadcast comes from the central control room, on the top floor of the main entrance building, the most exposed, indefensible position in this entire scrap heap, right in the middle of no man's land. Getting to it is a suicide run." Jade understood. It wasn't a weapon they could use. It was a resource they would have to fight for. The knowledge wasn't a gift. It was a new battleground. "Our deal is done," Cormac snarled. He and Jinx lifted the shivering twitch between them. "This changes nothing, Jedediah. When I find you alone, I will still gut you." "You'll have to find me first," Jade retorted, his voice cold as ice. The rust dogs backed away into the darkness, dragging their wounded man with them. The parley was over. The fragile truce had evaporated. Jade turned to his own group. Their faces were a mixture of fear, confusion, and a new, terrible understanding. "He's right," Jade said quietly. "Cappy's control room, that's the new prize. Whoever controls that broadcast controls the park's safe passages. We have to get to him. We have to understand how it works." "We can't trust them, Jade," Grizz rumbled. "This could be a trap. They could be leading us into an ambush." "It's not a trap," Pip said, his voice small but certain. Everyone looked at him. "When I was in the tunnel, before the big one came, I heard the rats squealing. Then the broadcast started, and everything went quiet, not just the rats, the little sounds, the dripping, the wetness. Jinx is telling the truth. The noise scared the small things away." Jade nodded. It fit. The pieces were slotting together into a horrifying mosaic. He looked at the faces of his small community. They were tired, wounded, and terrified. He was about to ask them to do the impossible, to mount an expedition into the most dangerous, contested part of the park to find a madman in a tower. It was a desperate gamble, but sitting still was a guaranteed death. "Marisol Kyra," Jade said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Take Pip. I want you to go to the food court. Cappy's nest is there. Be careful. Don't try to engage him. Just watch. See if you can find a pattern. See if he leaves where he goes. We need to know his routine before we can even think about approaching him." He turned to the remaining men. "Grizz, Ben, Finch, we have work to do. We're going to build defenses, not just walls, traps. We know the paths the rust dogs use now. We're going to make them regret every step they take in our direction. We have the knowledge. Now we turn it into steel and stone." The mood in the camp shifted. The fear was still there, a cold undercurrent. But now it was mixed with purpose. They had a goal. A long-shot, desperate, suicidal goal, but a goal nonetheless. As the others dispersed to their tasks, Jade stood alone for a moment, staring across the black water toward the rust dog's territory. The devil's bargain was complete. He had traded medical expertise for a piece of a puzzle, a piece that had made the board infinitely more complex and deadly. He had helped save the life of a man who would surely try to kill him later, and he felt a strange, cold certainty that it had been the right thing to do. Because in this new world, survival wasn't just about killing your enemies. It was about outthinking them, and he had just learned more about his enemy and his battlefield in the last 10 minutes than he had in the last 7 months. The price had been steep, but ignorance was a luxury he could no longer afford. Chapter 10: The Ghost in the Machine. The grand archway entrance to Splashdown Kingdom was a tombstone. Two massive, sun-bleached pillars held up a sagging crosspiece where the park's name was once proudly displayed. The top floor of the structure, a glass-walled observation deck that also housed the park's central control systems, was now a jagged crown of broken windows. This was Cappy's roost. This was the source of the broadcast. And from her hiding place in the ruins of the Candy Castle, sweet shop, Marisol watched it with a grim, analytical eye. She, Kyra, and Pip had spent the better part of a day moving in a wide, careful circle to get here. Every step was a lesson in tension. They skirted the edges of the wave pool, the sickly sweet smell of the feeding ground thick in the air. They moved through the skeletal remains of the arcade, its silent machines like rows of forgotten idols. The park felt different now. The knowledge of what lurked in the water had changed it. Every puddle was a menace. Every drain was a potential maw. Their hiding spot was perfect. The Candy Castle was a collapsed wreck of pastel-colored plaster and rebar, offering a dozen angles of concealed observation. They had a clear view of the entrance building and the plaza in front of it. "Anything," Pip whispered from his position a few feet away. He was using a pair of cheap binoculars they'd found, his movements small and precise. He had become an extension of the binoculars, his fear channeled into a razor-sharp focus. "Nothing," Marisol murmured back. "No movement, no lights." They had been watching for hours. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the bruised sky in shades of orange and purple. The park was sinking into its most dangerous time, twilight, the gloaming, the time when shapes became indistinct and shadows grew long, grasping fingers. "Maybe he's not there," Kyra said, her voice a low hum. She was sighting down the length of a sharpened piece of rebar, the same way a sniper might sight down a rifle. She was no longer the soft camper from before the raid. The encounter in the tunnel had burned something out of her and forged something harder in its place. "He's there," Pip stated with certainty. "You can feel it. The whole place feels occupied." He was right. There was an unnerving stillness about the entrance tower, the stillness of a predator's den when the predator is sleeping. They waited. The sky deepened to indigo. The temperature began to drop. Marisol's mind was a flurry of calculations. What was Jade's plan? To talk to the man, to capture him. Cappy was insane, but his insanity had a logic to it, an internal rhythm that was tied to the park's monstrous ecosystem. Disrupting that could have catastrophic, unforeseen consequences. Suddenly, a light flickered on in the control room. It wasn't a steady light like a lamp or a generator. It was a frantic, erratic strobe, a blue-white pulse that stabbed out into the twilight. It flashed a few times, then vanished. "What was that?" Kyra hissed. "Static discharge," Pip offered. "Old equipment." Before Marisol could respond, the broadcast started. The sound wasn't as loud here, so close to the source. They could hear it more clearly. It was a chaotic symphony of noise. The distorted, looping voice of a child saying the park is now closed was the most prominent sound, but underneath it, Marisol could now discern other layers. A high-frequency carrier wave that made her teeth ache. A deep, subsonic hum that she felt more in her bones than heard with her ears. And woven throughout, the cheerful, tinkling melody of the old Splashdown Kingdom theme song, warped and slowed to a funeral dirge. This wasn't just a broadcast, it was a complex audio signal, a weapon just as Jinx had said. "He's in there," Pip breathed, his binoculars fixed on the tower. As the broadcast wailed across the park, a figure appeared in one of the broken windows of the control room. It was a silhouette, hunched and thin, Cappy. He stood for a moment, looking out over his dead kingdom. Then he turned and began to move around the room, his movements jerky and ritualistic. He seemed to be touching the various consoles and control panels in a specific sequence, his hands dancing across the dead machinery. He was the ghost in the machine, a human operator running a system he no longer fully understood, guided by instinct and madness. "He's getting ready to leave," Marisol observed, her voice low and urgent. "This is the trigger. The broadcast signals the feeding and then he goes out." "Where does he go?" Kyra asked. As if in answer, Cappy disappeared from the windows. A few moments later, a small side door at the base of the tower creaked open. The man emerged, moving with a strange, shuffling gait. He was still wearing parts of his old mascot costume. The cheerful, oversized blue boots were on his feet, and the faded sailor's collar was around his neck. He carried a large, empty sack over his shoulder. He did not look left or right. He had a destination. He began to walk, not toward either of the camps, but on a path that led directly to the food court. His route was precise, almost rehearsed. He avoided certain areas, stepping carefully over patches of ground that looked no different from any other. He seemed to be navigating an invisible map of dangers. "We follow him," Marisol said, making the decision. "Stay in the shadows. Don't make a sound. We need to know his whole routine." They slipped out of the candy castle and began to tail the strange, lonely figure of the former mascot. It was a nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse. Cappy moved with a purpose that belied his apparent madness. He was on his way to his nest, but he was also doing something else: scavenging. He stopped at the ruins of a hot dog stand. He didn't look for food. He reached into a hollowed-out compartment behind a rusted grill and pulled out a small, sealed battery pack. He dropped it into his sack. A few hundred feet later, he stopped at a defunct first aid station and retrieved a roll of electrical tape from a hidden cache. "He's not just scavenging," Pip whispered, his mind putting the pieces together. "He's maintaining the system, the broadcast. He's keeping the machine alive." The realization was profound. Cappy wasn't just a madman triggering a routine. He was an engineer performing essential maintenance on the only weapon that could keep the park's lesser horrors at bay. He was, in his own insane way, a protector. They followed him all the way to the food court, a massive open-air pavilion with a collapsed roof. In the center of the debris, Cappy had built his nest. It was a bizarre, intricate structure of scavenged park banners, broken furniture, and tangled strings of festive lights. In the middle of it all was a single, comfortable-looking reclining chair, likely looted from a park office, facing a bank of salvaged electronic equipment. Speakers, amplifiers, and a jury-rigged tape deck were all wired together, powered by a collection of car batteries. This was his home, and this was the secondary source of his power. Cappy entered his nest and began his ritual. He unloaded his scavenged parts, tinkered with some wires, and then sat in his chair. He seemed to be listening, his head cocked, as the broadcast from the main tower echoed faintly in the distance. Marisol, Pip, and Kyra watched from the shadows of a destroyed pizzeria. They had the information they needed. They knew his route. They knew his purpose. But the knowledge made their situation even more complicated. They couldn't just remove Cappy. Doing so would silence the broadcast. And without the broadcast, the sludge spawn and who knew what else would be free to swarm the entire park. The tunnels would become impassable death traps. The drains would become monster dens. But they couldn't leave him alone either. Cormac and the Rust dogs knew about the broadcast too. It was only a matter of time before they made a play for the control tower. If Cormac got his hands on that power, he could turn it on and off at will, using it to herd the monsters, to cut off escape routes, to terrorize the commune into submission. "We are stuck," Kyra said, voicing the thought that was in all of their minds. "We can't kill him, and we can't let Cormac get to him." Marisol nodded slowly, her mind already moving to the next logical step. "Then we have to get to him first. Not to hurt him, to talk to him, to make a deal." "A deal with a madman," Kyra scoffed. "He's not just a madman," Pip interjected quietly. "He's a survivor. He understands the park better than anyone. Maybe he'll listen." Marisol looked at the lone figure in his nest of wires and forgotten dreams. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only one they had. They had to forge an alliance with the ghost in the machine before their enemies did. They had to convince the park's insane protector that the commune was not a threat, but a potential ally. And they had to do it before Cormac launched his inevitable, brutal assault on the tower. The race for Cappy's loyalty had just begun. Chapter 11: An Offering of Tools. Jedediah hammered the last piece of sharpened rebar into the ground, the impact jarring his wounded side. He grunted, leaning on the sledgehammer for a moment, sweat and rain mixing on his brow. The new defenses were crude, but they were vicious. They had spent 2 days turning the approaches to Kitty Cove into a nightmare of hidden pits, tripwires connected to noisemakers, and angled stakes hidden in the overgrown grass. They had learned the price of passive defense. Now their territory would bite back. Grizz stood nearby, testing the tension on a new tripwire made from scavenged electrical cable. "They'll see these," the big man rumbled. "Cormac's not stupid." "He doesn't have to fall into them," Jade replied, his voice grim. "He just has to know they're there. He has to slow down. He has to worry about where he puts his feet. That's the point. We take away his confidence." The work was exhausting, but it was good for morale. It gave the anxious, terrified members of the commune a focus, a way to channel their fear into productive action. Even Finch, his hands still trembling, had proven useful, his nimble fingers surprisingly adept at tying the complex knots needed for the tripwires. But as he worked, Jade's mind was elsewhere. It was with Marisol, Pip, and Kyra. They had returned late the previous night, their faces etched with a new, deeper understanding of their predicament. Their report on Cappy, the maintenance runs, the nest in the food court, the purpose behind his madness, had changed everything. Cappy wasn't a random variable. He was the system administrator for the entire park's dark ecosystem, and that made him the single most valuable asset or liability in their war for survival. Jade was cleaning his hands on a rag when he saw them approaching. Marisol and Pip. Kyra had taken the first watch on the newly fortified perimeter. "We need to talk," Marisol said, her tone serious. Jade nodded, leading them to the relative privacy of the snack shack's interior. "What's on your mind?" "Cappy," Marisol said, getting straight to the point. "Your plan is to approach him, but you can't go in with weapons. You can't go in with demands. He's a territorial animal protecting his nest. If he perceives you as a threat, he'll either flee or lash out in some way we can't predict. He might even shut down the broadcast entirely." "So what do you suggest?" Jade asked, respecting her analytical mind. "We bring him a gift," Pip said, speaking up. Jade was struck by how much the boy had changed in just a few days. The terror was still in his eyes, but it was overlaid with a new, hard-won maturity. When we watched him, he was collecting things, tools, parts. He's trying to keep his machines running, but his tools are probably garbage. Pip walked over to a corner of the shack where they kept their own tool cache. He picked up a small, professional-grade wire stripper and a multimeter he had painstakingly repaired. "We bring him these, not as a trade, as an offering, a gift, no strings attached, to show him we're not there to take his territory. We're there to help." Jade considered it. It was a risky, unconventional approach. It was based on psychology, on empathy for a man who was profoundly insane. But it was also brilliant. It reframed the encounter. They wouldn't be intruders. They would be fellow survivors offering aid. "It's a good plan," Jade said, nodding slowly. "But who goes? He knows your faces now. He might have seen you following him." "It has to be you, Jade," Marisol said. "You're the leader. He needs to see the person in charge. He needs to see you're not Cormac. You'll go alone, unarmed except for the offering. You'll approach his nest openly in the daylight. You'll show him you have nothing to hide." Jade's first instinct was to refuse. Going alone, unarmed, into the territory of a madman was a violation of every survival rule he had ever lived by. But as he looked at their earnest, determined faces, he knew they were right. A show of force would fail, a show of trust. It might just work. It was the only way. "All right," he said, the word feeling heavy in his mouth. "I'll do it. Tomorrow morning, right after the broadcast ends. That seems to be his quiet time." The next morning arrived gray and oppressive. The wailing of the park's broadcast, a sound Jade now understood as a temporary shield, faded into silence. The feeding was over. The park was quiet, but it was the loaded quiet of a predator digesting its meal. Jade prepared for his mission. He left his pipe behind, a decision that made him feel naked and vulnerable. In its place, he took the small toolkit Pip had assembled, the wire strippers, the multimeter, a roll of fresh electrical tape, and a handful of rare, undamaged AA batteries. He placed them in a canvas bag. This was his weapon, an offering of tools. He walked out of the fortified gate of the commune, alone. The park seemed to watch him, its faded colors and broken structures like the waiting eyes of hungry animals. He followed the route Marisol had described, the path Cappy himself took. He moved slowly, openly, making no attempt to hide. He was broadcasting his peaceful intentions with every step. The food court was a wreck, a testament to the slow, grinding power of nature reclaiming its own. He saw Cappy's nest in the center, a bizarre fortress of junk and memory, and he saw Cappy. The man was sitting in his recliner, tinkering with the tape deck, his back to Jade. He was humming to himself, the tuneless, melancholy melody of the Splashdown Kingdom theme. Jade stopped at the edge of the clearing, about 30 feet from the nest. He didn't want to startle him. "Cappy," Jade said, his voice calm and even. He was surprised at how steady it sounded. The humming stopped. Cappy's body went rigid. He did not turn around. "My name is Jedediah," Jade continued, keeping his tone soft. "I'm from the camp in Kitty Cove. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to take anything." Cappy remained silent, his back a stiff, unmoving wall of defiance. "I saw you were working on your equipment," Jade said, slowly reaching into his bag. "I used to be a contractor. I know a thing or two about wiring, I thought. I thought you might be able to use these." He took out the tools one by one and placed them on a flat, unbroken piece of concrete in front of him. The multimeter, the strippers, the tape, the batteries. He laid them out neatly like a shrine offering. "They're a gift," Jade said, "from my group to you for keeping the quiet hours. We appreciate the quiet hours." He was appealing to the man's purpose, acknowledging his role as the park's keeper. For a long moment there was no response. Jade's heart pounded. This was it, the moment of truth. Would the man attack? Would he scream? Would he simply ignore him? Slowly, almost painfully, Cappy turned his head. Jade got his first clear look at the man's face. It was a ruin, thin and gaunt with a tangled, matted beard. His eyes were the most shocking part. They were a startlingly bright blue, and they were filled not with madness but with an ancient, profound sadness and fear. Cappy's gaze flickered from Jade's face to the tools laid out on the concrete. His eyes lingered on the multimeter, a flicker of recognition, of need in their depths. He said nothing. He simply turned back around, facing his equipment. Jade stood there, unsure of what to do next. Had he failed? Was this a refusal? He waited. 1 minute, 2. Then Cappy spoke. His voice was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of a voice unused to conversation. "The condenser on the main amp is shot," he said, not to Jade but to the machine in front of him. "The signal is dirty." Jade blinked. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a diagnostic, a problem stated. It was, in its own strange way, an invitation, a test. I might have one, Jade said carefully. In our scrap pile I can look. A 40-volt maybe. Cappy's shoulders hitched, a small, almost imperceptible nod. Jade knew he had to leave it there. He had made the offering. He had opened the channel of communication. Pushing any further would break the fragile trust he had just forged. "I'll go look," Jade said. "I'll bring it back. I'll leave it right here for you." He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off Cappy. The man did not move. Jade turned and walked away, his heart beating a rhythm of cautious, unbelievable triumph. He had done it. He had made contact with the ghost in the machine. He hadn't found an ally, not yet. He had found something far more complex, a problem to be solved, a relationship to be built. He had offered tools. Cappy, in return, had offered a task. The first tentative thread of a bargain had been woven, and Jade knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that both his and Cormac's survival now depended on who could better serve the needs of the park's broken, lonely king. Chapter 12: The Siege of the Tower. The condenser was a small, cylindrical object, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone in Jade's hand. He had found it, against all odds, in Dell's chaotic pile of scavenged electronics. A perfect match. It was a key, and he was about to give it away. He returned to the food court the next morning, following the same ritual as before. He moved openly, alone and unarmed. He placed the condenser on the designated concrete slab and backed away. This time, Cappy turned his head almost immediately, his sad blue eyes fixing on the small, precious component. He gave the same almost imperceptible nod as before. A transaction was complete. For 3 days, this became Jade's new routine. He would visit the food court bringing small, useful offerings, a length of clean copper wire, a handful of fuses, a still-sharp razor blade for stripping insulation. He never pressed. He never asked for anything in return. He would place the item, state what it was, and leave. He was building trust one component at a time. He was demonstrating that he was a provider, not a threat. On the 4th day, he saw Cormac. Jade was hidden in a grove of overgrown, ornamental bamboo near the food court, observing Cappy from a distance when he saw the rust dogs. There were 4 of them: Cormac, Jinx, Breaker, and another one, Mags. They weren't moving toward the food court. They were moving with sleek, predatory purpose toward the park's main entrance, toward the control tower. Jade's blood ran cold. The diplomatic approach had been too slow. Cormac was done waiting, done negotiating. He was going for the source, a direct, frontal assault to seize the broadcast controls. Jade knew he couldn't stop them. He was one man and his side was still aching. But he had to do something. He had to warn Cappy. He broke cover and ran toward the food court, shouting, "Cappy, they're coming. They're going for the tower." Cappy spun around in his chair, a look of pure animal panic on his gaunt face. He saw Jade running toward him, saw the alarm in his eyes, and understood. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a small, patched-up backpack, scrambled out of his nest of wires, and fled, disappearing into a maze of collapsed structures behind the food court. He was abandoning his nest to protect the tower. Jade knew he had a choice. Follow Cappy and try to help him defend the tower, a suicidal proposition, or return to his own camp and brace for the consequences of Cormac taking control. He chose a third option. He sprinted back to the commune, his mind racing. Cormac making his move, he yelled as he burst into Kitty Cove. He's going for the control tower. Panic erupted. Grizz grabbed his wrench. Kyra, on watch, aimed her rebar spear toward the main plaza. "No," Jade commanded, his voice cutting through the fear. "We can't fight him there, it's his plan. He wants to draw us out into the open. We're not going to fight his battle, we're going to fight ours." He turned to Pip. "Pip, I need you to do something only you can do. You're the fastest. You're the only one who knows the quiet paths. I need you to get to the wave pool. Now." Pip's face went pale. "The maw." "Yes," Jade said, his voice grim and low. "Cormac is so focused on the tower, he's left his own home undefended. They took our medicine. I want you to go to their camp, the engine room, and take it back. Take anything else you can carry. We're going to cut the legs out from under him while his head is in the clouds." It was a desperate, vicious gambit, a looter's run. It was a page from Cormac's own playbook. Pip looked terrified, but he saw the hard logic in Jade's eyes. He nodded, grabbed a small, empty sack and disappeared, a ghost flitting through their fortified gate. Jade turned to the others. "The rest of you on the wall, we're going to watch this play out, and we're going to be ready for whatever comes next." From their position, they had a partial view of the grand archway. They saw the rust dogs reach the base of the tower. There was no subtlety. Breaker swung his sledgehammer, smashing the reinforced door off its hinges. They poured inside. Minutes later, lights flickered on the top floor. Shouts echoed across the empty plaza. They were fighting Cappy. The battle was short and brutal. A body, Cappy, was thrown through one of the remaining panes of glass. He fell, a terrifying ragdoll plunge onto the concrete canopy over the entrance turnstiles. He wasn't dead. He moved, trying to crawl away, but Breaker appeared at the broken window and hurled a piece of broken machinery down at him. It struck Cappy's leg with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, a raw, wounded sound, and lay still. The rust dogs had won. They had the tower. A moment of absolute silence fell over the park. Jade's heart sank. They had failed. Then the broadcast came on. But it was different. It wasn't the chaotic, layered signal of Cappy's design. It was a single, piercingly high-frequency tone. A solid, unwavering shriek that felt like a needle in the brain. Jinx was experimenting, trying to isolate the frequency that controlled the sludge spawn. The effect was immediate and horrifying. From every drain, every puddle, every inch of the lazy river and the murky depths of the wave pool, the creatures began to emerge. Not just the sludge spawn, everything. The high-pitched tone didn't repel the lesser creatures. It agitated them, drove them into a frenzy. It was like kicking an anthill the size of the entire park. The water in the canal boiled with black, writhing shapes. The ground near the tunnels grew slick as dozens of the smaller, eyeless gutter gorgon young, things they hadn't even known existed, poured out into the open, hissing and clicking. And the big ones, the 3 adult gutter gorgons in the maw, they went berserk. Enraged by the sound, they surged out of the wave pool not with slow purpose but with frantic, destructive speed. They weren't hunting. They were rampaging. From the tower, the rust dogs watched the chaos they had unleashed. Cormac appeared at the broken window, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He had a weapon that could turn the entire park into a churning sea of monsters. He had the power of a god. Jedediah, Cormac's voice, amplified by the park's PA system, boomed across the landscape, distorted and monstrous. You see the power I have. This is the end of your little kingdom. I am the king now. To prove his point, the high-pitched tone stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then a new sound began, a deep, throbbing, subsonic pulse, the frequency that called the large predators. The three adult gutter gorgons stopped their rampage. Their eyeless heads swiveled in unison, not toward the maw, but toward the loudest source of the vibration, toward the control tower, toward Cormac. The look of triumph on Cormac's face vanished, replaced by dawning horror. He screamed into the microphone, "Jinx, shut it off, shut it off." The subsonic pulse stopped, but it was too late. The dragons had been summoned. They had a target. They began to move toward the grand archway, their immense bodies shaking the ground, their hisses echoing in the terrified silence. Cormac and his crew were trapped in the tower with the very monsters they had tried to command. They had kicked the anthill, and now the ants were coming to devour them. From the commune's wall, Jade watched, his face grim. This wasn't a victory. This was an apocalypse. The siege of the tower had failed, and in its place, a new, far more terrible reign of chaos had just been unleashed upon them all. Chapter 13. The King is Dead. The world had become a symphony of screams. The screams of the rust dogs trapped in the tower, amplified and distorted by the PA system. The enraged hisses of the gutter gorgons closing in on their target, and the silent, terrified screams in the minds of every member of the commune as they watched the apocalypse unfold. "Get down," Jade roared, pulling a stunned-looking Finch away from the edge of their wall. "Get away from the gate, now." The park was no longer a hunting ground. It was a slaughterhouse. The agitated lesser creatures, driven into a frenzy by Jinx's sonic torture, were swarming everywhere. A wave of sludge spawn flowed out of the lazy river, a living carpet of black, heat-draining horror, surging up the concrete banks. The smaller, juvenile gorgons scurried in and out of the shadows, their movements frantic and unpredictable. Jade and his people could only watch, trapped in their small, fortified island in a sea of monsters. At the base of the control tower, the three adult gutter gorgons arrived. They didn't bother with the door. The first one slammed its immense, eyeless head into the concrete support pillar. The entire structure shuddered. The second clawed its way up the side of the building, its thick talons finding purchase in the window frames, its pale, translucent belly scraping against the wall. From inside the tower, the sounds were of pure panic. The rust dogs were trapped. Cormac's booming voice was gone, replaced by terrified shouts and the sound of furniture being thrown against the remaining doors. The gorgon on the wall reached the broadcast level. It smashed its head through the broken window frame, its black, hole-like mouth gaping. A human scream was cut off abruptly. The creature pulled back, something limp and dark dangling from its maw. Mags. The other two gorgons continued their assault on the base of the tower. Concrete cracked and groaned. Rebar screamed as it was bent past its breaking point. The entire grand archway began to tilt, groaning like a dying beast. In that moment, as chaos reigned, Pip returned. He slipped through a weak point in the back fence, a sack slung over his shoulder, his face pale but his eyes burning with a fierce, triumphant light. He ran to Jade, shoving the sack into his hands. "I got it," he panted. "I got it all." Jade looked inside. It was their stolen medicine, and more. Extra bandages, bottles of iodine, even a few precious bags of saline solution. Pip hadn't just looted. He had stripped the Rust Dog's infirmary bare. In the face of the apocalypse, the boy had completed his mission. It was a small, insane victory in a war that had just escalated beyond all comprehension. "Good lad," Jade breathed, a surge of pride cutting through his terror. "Now get inside, stay down." The end of the tower came quickly. With a final, deafening groan, the main support pillar shattered. The entire grand archway structure, the proud entrance to Splashdown Kingdom, collapsed in on itself. It fell in a slow-motion cascade of concrete, steel, and glass, raising a tremendous cloud of dust. The Gorgons scattered, avoiding the falling debris. The screaming from the PA system stopped. Silence descended, broken only by the hissing of the remaining monsters and the settling of the ruins. The tower was gone. Cormac was gone. Jinx, Breaker, all of them. Buried. The Rust Dogs, the long-standing human threat that had defined their existence in the park, had been annihilated in less than 10 minutes. The king is dead. The thought flashed through Jade's mind, but there was no triumph in it, only a vast, terrifying emptiness. The monsters that had killed his enemies were still there, and the weapon that had, however imperfectly, kept them in check was now a pile of rubble. The broadcast was silent. Forever. As the dust began to settle, the behavior of the creatures started to change. The frenzied agitation from Jinx's signal faded. The gutter Gorgons, their primary target destroyed, seemed confused. They sniffed at the pile of rubble, their quest for vengeance unsatisfied. But the smaller things, the sludge spawn, the juvenile Gorgons, without the low-level hum of Cappy's broadcast to keep them dormant, they began to move with a new, exploratory purpose. They were no longer just agitated. They were spreading. The invisible fences that had contained them were gone. The entire park was now their territory. Jade watched as a tide of sludge spawn flowed past their walls, ignoring them, moving out toward the park's perimeter fences. They were testing the boundaries of their world. Then he saw a movement on the rubble of the canopy where Cappy had fallen. A hand. The old man was alive. Battered, his leg clearly broken, but alive. He pushed a piece of plaster off his chest and tried to sit up, his face a mask of agony and despair as he stared at the ruins of his tower. His machine was broken. His life's work was destroyed. He looked across the plaza, his sad blue eyes meeting Jade's. For a moment, their shared understanding hung in the air. They were the last two kings of a dead kingdom, the park's protector and the commune's leader. Both had failed. Both had survived. The largest of the three adult gutter Gorgons, its rage subsiding into a simple, predatory hunger, turned its eyeless head. It sensed the movement. It sensed Cappy. It began to move slowly toward the canopy, a pale, inevitable death. Jade knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. His rivalry with Cormac had been a simple war of men. This was different. This was a war against the fundamental nature of the park itself. And Cappy, the broken ghost, was no longer just a variable. He was the only person alive who understood the enemy. He was the key. "Grizz, Pip, Kyra with me," Jade yelled, grabbing his pipe. "The rest of you seal the gate, don't open it for anything." He scrambled over the wall, not waiting for an answer. He had a new mission, born of the ashes of the old one. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He wasn't scavenging for supplies. He was launching a rescue mission. A desperate, suicidal charge into a park swarming with monsters to save the one man who might know how to survive them. The king was dead. Long live the king. He just had to keep the old man alive long enough to claim his twisted, broken crown. Chapter 14. A Kingdom of Scars. The charge across the plaza was a charge through hell. The world was a churning, hissing mass of living nightmares. Juvenile gorgons, the size of large dogs, darted between chunks of rubble, their eyeless heads snapping at anything that moved. The ground was slick with the slime of the sludge spawn, a treacherous carpet of cold, black hunger. Jade ran at the head of his small squad, his pipe held low. There was no room for strategy, only for brutal, forward momentum. A small gorgon lunged from behind a busted planter, and Grizz met it with a crushing blow from his wrench, smashing it into the concrete before it could latch on. "The big one," Jade yelled, his voice raw. "Kyra, Pip, go for Cappy. We'll draw its attention." The adult gutter gorgon was focused on its prize. It was halfway to the canopy where Cappy lay, moving with a slow, inevitable purpose. It hadn't seen them yet. "Hey!" Jade roared, scooping up a fist-sized piece of concrete and hurling it at the creature's flank. The rock bounced harmlessly off its pale, thick hide, but the impact did its job. The monster stopped. It turned its long, flat head toward the source of the vibration. Its lipless mouth opened, emitting a low, guttural hiss. It was now focused on them. "Pip, go," Kyra commanded, giving the boy a shove. She stood her ground, her rebar spear held in a two-handed grip, planting herself between Pip and the swarming lesser creatures, a grim sentinel buying him precious seconds. Pip ran, his small frame a blur of motion. He was no longer the scared boy from the tunnels. He moved with a desperate, practiced agility, leaping over grasping slime pools and dodging the snapping jaws of the smaller horrors. The adult gorgon charged Jade and Grizz. It was terrifyingly fast, its heavy body propelled forward by its powerful, clawed limbs. "Split!" Jade yelled. He went left and Grizz went right. The monster, confused for a split second by the dual targets, hesitated, giving them the opening they needed. Grizz slammed his wrench against the side of a rusted-out park van, the loud clang echoing across the plaza. The creature swiveled toward the louder noise. It lunged at Grizz, who barely managed to dive behind the van as its jaws snapped shut on empty air, punching a deep dent in the vehicle's side. Meanwhile, Pip reached the canopy. Cappy was conscious, his face a white mask of pain. He looked at Pip with his sad, terrified eyes. "Have to," Cappy rasped, his voice a dry whisper. The water, it's all connected. We're getting you out of here, Pip said, grabbing the man's thin arm. Kyra arrived a moment later, having dispatched a smaller Gorgon with a vicious thrust of her spear. "He's right," she said to Pip. "We can't carry him. We have to drag him." Together, they began to pull the broken man off the concrete slab, Cappy crying out as his shattered leg was jostled. The gutter Gorgon, enraged at having missed Grizz, turned its attention back to Jade. It swiped a massive forelimb and Jade threw himself backward, the creature's claws gouging deep furrows in the concrete where he had just been standing. He was outmatched. Their distraction wouldn't last. "Its neck," a voice screamed. It was Cappy, propped up by Kyra and Pip, pointing a trembling finger. "The slits. It breathes through the slits on its neck." Jade saw them then. Just behind the creature's powerful jawline, a series of vertical, pulsating slits like those of a shark. They were weeping the same black, oily fluid as its wounds, a weak spot, the only one they had. He had one chance. He yelled, a pure, primal sound of defiance, and charged the monster. Not its head, but its side. The creature turned to meet him, its mouth opening wide. Jade didn't slow. At the last possible second, he planted his foot and vaulted off a piece of rubble, using his momentum to bring him up and alongside the creature's head. He drove the end of his steel pipe forward with all the strength in his body, aiming for the gills Cappy had revealed. The pipe punched through the soft, fleshy membrane with a sickening, wet tear. The gutter Gorgon's reaction was instantaneous and explosive. It let out a piercing, agonized shriek that was nothing like its previous hisses. It thrashed wildly, its powerful body slamming against the ground, convulsing in pure agony. It wasn't dead, but Jade had crippled it, dealt it a wound that went deeper than its thick hide. It forgot about them, its entire being consumed by the searing pain in its respiratory system. It began to retreat, scrambling blindly back toward the perceived safety of the wave pool, its shrieks echoing its agony. "Now!" Jade roared, landing hard on the pavement, his wounded side screaming in protest. Grizz emerged from behind the van. The four of them converged on Cappy, lifting him in a clumsy fireman's carry. They began the long retreat back to Kitty Cove, a fighting withdrawal through a tide of swarming monsters. They moved as a single unit, a desperate four-pointed star of survival. Jade and Grizz took the front and back, their weapons swinging, clearing a path. Kyra and Pip flanked them, protecting Cappy, their own weapons lashing out at any creature that got too close. They reached the fortified gate, screaming for it to be opened. Ben and Finch, their faces white with terror, heaved the barricade aside. The small team stumbled through, collapsing inside their sanctuary as the gate was slammed shut and barred behind them. They had done it. They were alive. Marisol was there instantly, her professional calm a stark contrast to the bloody, panting state of the rescue team. She took one look at Cappy's mangled leg and the exhaustion on the others' faces and went to work. Later, as the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache, Jade stood on the wall of his compound. The shrieking of the wounded Gorgon had faded, but the park was not quiet. The low hisses and clicks of the swarming lesser creatures were a constant, unnerving chorus. The world outside his walls was now irrevocably alien territory, a place where they were no longer just hiding, but were actively besieged. He looked down into his camp. Grizz was cleaning his wrench. Pip was sitting quietly, staring at the sack of medicine he'd recovered, the weight of his actions settling upon him. Kyra was methodically sharpening her spear, her movements economical and deadly. And Marisol was carefully setting Cappy's leg, the old man sipping weakly at a cup of broth, his sad, blue eyes watching everything. He was a part of them now, their broken prophet, their mad engineer, their only hope. Cappy caught Jade's eye from across the compound. The old man's face was still a mask of pain, but for the first time there was something else there, too. A glimmer of lucid connection. He lifted his cup in a small, shaky gesture, a salute, acknowledgement, a pact sealed not with words but with shared violence and mutual survival. Jade nodded back, a slow, tired motion. The rust dogs were gone. The tower was a tomb. The broadcast was silent. They had more medicine, but they also had more monsters. They had lost their prison's fragile order and inherited a kingdom of pure, untamed chaos. He gripped the rough concrete of the wall, his knuckles white. This was his home, a kingdom of junk and faded dreams surrounded by a moat of monsters. It was a kingdom of scars. And as its weary, wounded king, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had not won. They had simply survived the fall of the old world. Now the real work of living in the new one began. The end.